We'll call the meeting to order, and pursuant to order of reference on Wednesday, November 8th, 2017, the committee is studying Bill C-63, a second act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 22nd, 2017. And so welcome to all the witnesses. We appreciate you coming. Before I go to the witnesses, we will just change the agenda a little bit. At 6:15, we will deal with Mr. Dussault's motion, which was tabled on Tuesday and given the proper amount of notice. And after that discussion, we will have to go in camera to deal with some of the business issues of the committee and the costs of holding hearings. So we'll try, and if the second panel is here at 10 to 5, we will make the switch then between the panels. Okay? Then as an individual, Ian Lee, Associate Professor, Carleton University. Ian, floor is yours, and we'll try and hold the comments to about 5 minutes if we could.
Okay, I thank the committee for inviting me to speak on the issues before us today. First, my disclosures. I don't consult to anyone or anything anywhere, not governments, not unions, not corporations, which means I'm not a registered or unregistered lobbyist. I don't belong to or contribute to any political party. This is salient for what I'm about to say in the next 3.5 minutes. In about 70 days now, I'm passing involuntarily into that club called the Seniors of Canada. Before, I want to talk briefly about the whole issue of deficits, but only as the prelude to talk about the greatest crisis that's facing Canada and every Western country, and that's the grey tsunami over the next 20 years or so, which is going to profoundly affect every OECD country. Before and after the great downsizing of the 1995 federal budget and deficit, there was then and still remains or continues extensive debate in Canada concerning what I believe are two false premises concerning deficit reduction. First, it's argued Canada is a very wealthy country and deficits will not break or bankrupt this country, so don't worry about it. The second argument that's put forward, which I believe is a false argument, is that policy X, let's say the Canada benefit, is an excellent policy, therefore deficits are justified. I just want to put those to bed and then get on to the bigger issue. Of course, Canada is a wealthy country. I've traveled all around the world in many developing countries and developed countries, and we are fabulously wealthy on a per-person basis. One of the wealthiest in the world, approximately equal with Germany on a per-person basis, and Germany is indeed the wealthiest country in Europe. But that's no justification to squander scarce public resources. And secondly, yes, there are excellent policies in the books, but that does not justify deficits. Rather, it justifies pruning and judicious program review of, to paraphrase Governor Carney, dead programs. I want to turn now, in the very few minutes I have, because I really do think it's the biggest crisis facing us. The IMF has said so. It's going to, they said, be exceed far more greatly the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. I first became interested in this subject after reading a book in 1999 called Grey Dawn, How the Coming Age Wave Will Transform America and the World. It was authored by Pete Peterson, the former Commerce Secretary under President Ronald Reagan, and who later founded what became the very prestigious Peterson Institute in Washington. In the years since, a plethora of authoritative empirical studies have been published by the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, reputable think tanks such as the Brookings, Peterson, CD Howe, MLI, on the subject of aging, on the macroeconomic economy, on tax receipts, and economic growth and productivity. Both the IMF and the OECD have produced increasingly dire studies and warnings about the increasingly serious squeeze on fiscal revenues caused by a smaller percentage of the workforce employed paying taxes and the concomitant dramatic increase in healthcare costs for the exploding number of seniors. As one American demographer recently noted, in approximately 20 years, all of North America is going to look like Florida, but without the warm weather. In other words, 1 in 4 people will be over the age of 65. And as I've already mentioned, the IMF has argued the aging crisis is going to impose far larger costs on our society over the next 10, 20, 30 years than the 2008-9 crisis. Closer to home, former Governor Dr. David Dodge and former Deputy Minister of Health published a superb report called Chronic Healthcare Spending Disease in 2011, showing the gargantuan amount of healthcare per capita for those over 75, and the numbers over 75 are skyrocketing. Very recently, the PBO published a report showing that provincial budgets are going to become increasingly bleak going forward because most costs associated with aging are funded by the provinces. Having read and absorbed a number of these excellent studies, I've come to the conclusion that the cost of pensions will not be the problem that the OECD argues they'll become in Europe, precisely because of Canada's prudent, responsible, risk-diversified four-pillar pension system, which is unfortunately criticized by some of my colleagues in academia. This is not to minimize the drag and loss of productivity and economic growth caused by the enormous loss of workers. But every serious economic study, including Finance Canada, shows long-term GDP declines of 1% to 2% annually. No, I've concluded that the vulnerability in Canada and likely elsewhere is healthcare. As Dr. Dodge demonstrated in his report using CIHI data, the older we are above 65, the more we consume per person per year. As we move from our 70s to our 80s...
I'll get you to slow down just a wee bit, please.
Okay. As we move from our 70s to our 80s, and this is in his report from CIHI, we consume an average of around $25,000 per person per year. This is the equivalent of consuming a new Honda Civic every year. Do I believe, or we believe, that the young people in this room or across this country are shouting, whoopee, whoopee, I'm going to get to pay a lot more taxes in the future to support Ian Lee and all the boomers in the years ahead? For these reasons, the overarching purpose of government policy should be concerning seniors, should be focusing on keeping this huge increase in seniors in their homes for as long as possible. And so what I really want to talk about very quickly, and then I'll wrap up. Firstly, in terms of pension reform, we need to be discussing a lot more about what we can do, such as eliminating early retirement before 60 across the board, penalizing retirement between 60 and 65, pension reform to eliminate incoherence within our policy frameworks, such as OAS allowing 65 retirement, CPP a range of 60 to 70, while employer pensions allow retirement as early as 65. We need to standardize there. We need to end the rule that prohibits RSPs and pensions after 71, in other words, that we have to take it. And then secondly, and then I'll finish, Mr. Chair, we need to completely invert the paradigm of healthcare to a model where we assume healthcare is delivered within the home. And we assume now it's delivered within what I characterize as legacy hospitals, large, enormous, expensive hospitals, rather than local, decentralized regional hospitals or community clinics as a second instance, again, to encourage seniors to remain in our home. In conclusion, policy can ameliorate, but it will not eliminate, the grey tsunami that is inevitably coming to Canada and other OECD countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Turning then to the Canadian Labour Congress, Mr. Youssef, President, and Ms. Smallman, National Director, Women's and Human Rights.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, colleagues and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you here today. I will, of course, discuss CLC position on two of the issues, of course, in the bill. Family violence leave, of course, and changes to Part 3 of the Canada Labour Code. For years, the Canadian Labour Congress, of course, and the labour movement have insisted that domestic violence must be recognized as a workplace issue. CLC has been a strong advocate for workplace protection and support of victims, of course, of domestic violence. This Bill C-63, of course, create a new leave to allow, of course, people experiencing domestic violence time off to deal with the effects, of course, of the violence and take steps to address it, and we welcome, of course, this action. Unfortunately, of course, it falls short of providing support for job protection that people experience and domestic violence and need, of course. Designated paid leave is a vital component, of course, of helping survivors keep their job and their economic security. Employment is a key pathway of leaving, of course, a violent relationship. Dedicated paid leave give workers, of course, a job protection time to do the things that they need to do, things to keep themselves and their children and family members safe. Whether that is, of course, obtaining counseling, getting a new bank account, meet with lawyers, or, of course, the police. These are things that you need time to do during standard, of course, daytime. It also, of course, gives them the financial security they need to take steps to leave. This can be expensive undertaking. Paid leave also is important because, of course, the dynamics of power and control of an abusive relationship. Research showed that 90% of domestic violence survivors experience financial control. And accessing unpaid leave, of course, result in a lower pay, of course, check that the abuser is expecting. They may be, of course, serious consequence for the victim. The unintended result of not providing paid leave, of course, it might increase, of course, the risk of workers, and it may create, of course, barriers for victims. We also like to flag concern about the exception clause. We understand the intention is to ensure the leave be reserved for victims of domestic violence, not the abuser. However, the exception clause may pose a barrier to victims who end up being accused and charged themselves. This could happen in a situation where, of course, they retaliate or stand up to the abuser, or in a situation where the police lay dual charges in regard to domestic violence. In our opinion, the language of being a victim should be suffice to limit the perpetrator's rights to the leave. No one should, of course, have to choose between the abused and a paycheck. We urge the committee to ensure 10 days of family leave are paid leave. We urge, of course, careful attention to be made, of course, to the potential barriers created by the details in the provisions. Regarding the changes in Part 3 of the Canada Labour Code, Bill 363, of course, contains several important changes for the federal labour standards. Among these steps, the bill reserved the previous government approval of unpaid internship outside, of course, the approved educational program. Requires, of course, advance notice for changes to shift scheduling. Allow time off in compensation for overtime work, and provide a limit, of course, the right to refuse overtime. These are significant and positive steps in the right direction. However, I do say something about the process. In the spring of this year, the Labour Program, of course, began consulting broadly on the recommendation of the 2006 Archer's report. And it proposes, of course, to strengthen the compliance and enforcement in Part 3 rights. Our preference is to continue to be that where we have integrated and comprehensive discussion about strengthening the federal standards and, of course, conducting effective compliance and enforcement regime under the code. I want to thank the committee for the opportunity, of course, to present here today and welcome any questions the committee members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Youssef. Canadian Union of Public Employees, Ms. Pasma, Research Officer, and Ms. Dandy, Director of Equality. The floor is yours.
Thank you and good afternoon. Elizabeth and I are pleased to be here this afternoon to speak to you on behalf of the 651,000 employees of the Canadian Union of Public Employees. I want to start by echoing the comments that were just made by the Canadian Labour Congress about consultation and process. CUPE is disappointed that these changes to the Canada Labour Code are being made in an omnibus budget bill. This means these changes will not get the fulsome scrutiny and debate that they deserve. We recommend that Division 8 be separated from Bill C-63 and studied and voted on separately. We are also concerned that the changes in Bill C-63 do not go far enough in providing important protections and reasonable access to leaves for workers in federal jurisdiction. We believe that the federal government should be setting a high standard, meeting or exceeding the best provincial standards. Unfortunately, some of the new standards proposed by Bill C-63 are well below the strongest provincial standards. For instance, we are concerned that giving employees only 24 hours advance notice of schedules or shift changes falls well below the standard of 1 week notice set by Saskatchewan. We are also concerned that the broad exemption in the Act could render the requirement meaningless. Advance notice of working hours is important for workers to be able to carry out other activities like childcare and education. We also know that uncertainty over work schedules contributes to precarity, stress, and work-life conflict. Given this, why should the ordinary working of the employer's establishment take precedence and be given the same kind of priority as a serious threat to health or safety? We recommend that the requirement for advance notice be extended from 24 hours to 1 week and that the third exemption relating to the ordinary working of the employer's establishment be deleted. We have the same concern about the right to refuse overtime for family responsibility. Allowing an exemption for the ordinary working of the employer's establishment is too broad, and it means that the employer's rights are being prioritized over the well-being of families and children. What kind of society are we if a child can be left waiting at daycare for mom or dad to pick them up, for no other reason than because an industrial establishment would otherwise not be working as it ordinarily did? We recommend that this exemption be deleted, which would also make this clause consistent with the best provincial standards. With regard to the right to request flexible work arrangements, we are concerned that this change does not create a meaningful new right. The clauses do not require an employer to consider the request any more seriously than they might have before. They simply require the employer to provide a response in writing. CUPE believes that instead of a symbolic gesture that fails to accomplish real change, the government should be making significant changes in support of the most vulnerable workers, precarious workers who are forced to be flexible against their will.
We're happy that the issue of family violence is being addressed in the Canada Labour Code in the form of a new leave for survivors of family violence. So the focus of our recommendation, violence requires stable, ongoing, paid employment to enable them to leave violent relationships and seek safety. Unpaid leave defeats the purpose of family violence leave, which should be to give a survivor the financial security that they need to achieve safety and stability. Many survivors won't be able to take the leave if it is unpaid. The bill also allows the employer the discretion to require that the leave be no less than 1 day's duration. We recommend that survivors be given the flexibility to take the leave in periods of less than 1 day. Many survivors typically require an hour or two at a time to address a number of basic tasks that they need to carry out to ensure their safety, tasks that the CLC referred to, such as meeting with a lawyer or opening a bank account, which is separate from their abusers. We would also like to comment on the new leave of 5 unpaid days for traditional Aboriginal practices. We're very concerned about leaving the highly contentious issue of determining Indigenous status in the hands of employers. We recommend that the committee consult with Indigenous organizations on the requirement to provide documentation proving Aboriginal identity, and also on the range of Indigenous practices covered by the clause. So thank you, and we look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pasma and Ms. Standy. Multiple Sclerosis Society of Canada, Mr. Davis, National Vice President. Welcome.
Good afternoon, and thank you for providing me with the opportunity to speak here today. I am here representing all Canadians who are affected by MS and the provisions put forth in this Budget Amendment Act. MS is a chronic, often, but not always, disabling disease of the central nervous system, affecting the brain, spinal cord, and optic nerve. Different people experience different symptoms and outcomes, and there is no one kind of MS. MS is one of the most common neurological diseases affecting young adults in Canada. Most people are diagnosed between the ages of 15 and 40, the ages that many are in the workforce. In consideration of Bill C-63, Division 8, Part 5A and C, we support the amendment to make work work by including more flexible employment policies to allow people with MS and other episodic disabilities to remain in the workforce. This would be good policy for compassionate reasons, for social reasons, and for economic reasons. This would include making improvements to income and disability supports for people who are unable to work or can only work on an intermittent basis, thereby providing them with a more flexible environment in which they can work. We support the provisions B and H in Section 2 of Part 1 that would first give more authority to nurse practitioners for tax purposes, allowing them to sign off on a person's health issues, and changes that would improve the accuracy and consistency of the income tax legislation and regulations, allowing people living with an episodic disability like MS to receive the disability tax credit, for example. I could get into a technical discussion, but as you deliberate on the various provisions, please reflect on the following stories from real people living with MS. Penny worked full-time until her MS symptoms took over. She needed a different position. She could still work, but needed the flexibility to work part-time so she could manage her health. She left her job and is trying to find a more flexible environment, but in the meantime, Penny must rely on social assistance. If there was a flexible work-sharing program in place, Penny could have reduced her hours while receiving partial EI support, allowing her to stay in the career that she loved and costing the social development system less money. Dave was recovering from a significant relapse of his MS and required full-time nursing for a period of time. But because he was not gravely ill with a significant risk of dying, his wife couldn't take compassionate care leave. There was no flexibility with this leave, so she had to quit her job to look after Dave, leaving this family with no income at all for several months. Everyone loses in this situation: the family, the individuals, and the labor market. It simply doesn't make sense. Sharon has been unable to work full-time for the past several years because of her MS. Sometimes when she's feeling well, she can work, but the short-term work keeps her income low. She doesn't fit into the current definition of disability, so doesn't qualify for the disability tax credit, and because her income is low, the credit wouldn't make a difference anyway. Sharon spends an inordinate amount of time trying to navigate the complexity of multiple avenues of partial assistance. A flexible work arrangement could allow Sharon to work consistently, but within the parameters of her MS symptoms, giving her financial security. Time and time again, we hear that people want to work. They can work. They are able, mentally and physically, but it may not be always in the traditional sense, 9 to 5 or regular shift work. There needs to be an avenue for employees to request flexible work arrangements. The current income and social support systems create an environment that forces people with episodic disabilities either in the workforce or out. Episodic illness is a square peg in a round hole with no flexibility at all. Half of working-age Canadians with disabilities have a disease which is episodic. It comes and goes. It could be MS, mental health, arthritis, and/or a host of others. Implementing small changes would alleviate some of the financial and human resource burdens to the current systems. Changes such as allowing more flexibility for employees living with an episodic disease or illness to continue to be in the workforce, contributing to our economy. Making the income tax legislation and regulations consistent and improving the parameters around the definitions of disability. These changes would better support people with episodic illnesses, allow them the flexible environments to contribute to the economy and workforce, cost support systems less, and alleviate economic, emotional, and social stress. They would also decrease pressures on employers to rehire and retrain new workers. These amendments are the right thing to do for individuals, for families, for society, and also for the labor force and economy. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. Then Portfolio Management Association of Canada, Ms. Walmsley, and who's president, and Mr. Adelson, head of legal for Canada Invesco. Okay.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. The Portfolio Management Association of Canada represents over 240 investment management firms from across Canada who collectively manage over $1.6 trillion for Canadians, much of which is pension plans, group, and individual RRSPs. We've presented to this committee frequently over the years, and our recommendations typically are focused on retirement savings and ensuring fair tax treatment of retirement savings, which are typically tax exempt, with the overriding principle that Canadians deserve increased access to low-cost investment opportunities and fairness to help grow their pensions and RSPs. Segregated funds are insurance products very similar to mutual funds but produced by insurance companies that provide returns based on segregated pool of assets. According to a 2017 report by Strategic Insight, Canadians invest $117 billion in segregated funds. We were very pleased in Federal Budget 2017 that the budget extended the tax-deferred merger rules to segregated funds, which allowed for these funds to merge and gain efficiencies when appropriate without negative tax consequences to Canadians holding these hybrid insurance and retirement savings vehicles. We are here today because there was a bit of an oversight in the budget, we believe, and we'd like to request that these rules be extended to prospectus-exempt pooled funds. As you know, most Canadians working for companies typically have one of three types of retirement savings plans. A traditional defined benefit plan, which are not growing. The more common types nowadays are defined contribution plans and group RSPs. Defined contribution plans and group RSPs frequently invest in pooled funds as they are much lower cost than traditional retail mutual funds and provide the asset mix diversity needed for Canadians to save for their retirement. Pooled investment vehicles offer Canadians, particularly the middle class, with access to various asset classes on a cost-effective basis, given the ability to find economies of scale by pooling investments and sharing costs. Unless the investment merger rules are extended beyond the segregated funds to the underlying pooled funds that they invest in, a merger at the segregated fund level will be impacted by tax consequences of the mergers of the underlying pooled funds. This would result in lower investment returns for the average Canadian with an employer-sponsored defined contribution pension plan. My colleague Eric Adelson will now provide more details on a specific example.
Thank you, Katie. Investment fund companies manage many funds for insurance companies that are accessed by Canadians through group retirement savings programs or defined contribution pension plans. According to a 2017 report by Strategic Insight, Canadians invested $65 billion in pooled funds, and the main source of this investment is employer-sponsored defined contribution pension plans. Funds grow and decline with employee population, and to manage these on a low-cost basis to optimize returns, companies need to be able to merge funds on occasion without negatively impacting the end investor. The extension of the tax-deferred merger rules to prospectus-exempt pooled funds would provide consistent tax treatment of mutual funds and segregated funds for the benefit of Canadian savers. The most common example of this is what we would call target date funds. In most defined contribution pension plans, target date funds are the default investment option. So a great many middle-class Canadians own target date funds. These funds have a maturity date, which is included in the name of the fund, and use an asset allocation strategy that gets more conservative the closer you get to maturity. So if someone anticipates retiring in 2030, they would invest in a fund with 2030 in the name of the fund. At maturity, the investor typically retires, and they don't necessarily want to take a lump sum immediately. They can take that, but more typically, we would merge the fund into a broader diversified fund through which the investor can draw down over time. This gives investors an easy-to-exercise choice of what to do with their retirement savings. The problem is if the target date funds hold stocks and bonds directly, we can merge the funds and defer taxes until the investor withdraws money. But if the target date fund holds pooled funds, which in turn hold stocks and bonds, the target date fund merger would give rise to immediate tax consequences, which differs from regular mutual funds and insurance companies' segregated fund products.
We thank the committee for the opportunity to present and welcome questions.
Thank you both, and thank you to all the witnesses. We'll go 7-minute round, the first four. Mr. Greywall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming today. Much appreciated. I'm going to talk about what I just heard on the Portfolio Management Association of Canada. Can you quickly restate that example you gave on if it was held in, sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, if it's held in mutual funds, there wouldn't be a negative tax consequences. But if it was held in pooled funds, there would be negative tax consequences. Right. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And keep in mind, the only difference really from an Income Tax Act perspective between a pooled fund and a regular mutual fund is the number of people that hold it. So a regular mutual fund has to have 150 unit holders, each holding at least $500.
Yeah.
Whereas in a pooled fund, if you don't meet that test, then you're a pooled fund, and the rules are more restrictive under the tax code. But the problem is the people that hold the pooled funds are buying it through a collective.
Okay, and so, and how many percentage of Canadians, when they're planning for retirement, are taking pool funds versus mutual funds? And what's the advantages and disadvantages for, let's say, a 32-year-old person like myself?
I'm not sure the percentage.
Yeah, I'm not sure at the percentage, but we know that for group RSPs and defined contribution plans, they are typically invested in pooled funds, and that's $65 billion. Whereas mutual funds are the ones that are typically accessed by the general public, not through the employer-sponsored plans. And the employer-sponsored plans, they want to maximize the investment returns and keep the costs low. So pooled funds are a much more efficient vehicle because they're not subject to a lot of the legal disclosure requirements because they're not going to the general public. They're going to a specific employer-sponsored plan. So it's a lower percentage, but it's, the $117 billion that are in segregated insurance products was addressed in the budget, but the $65 billion was missed, and we believe it was just an oversight. That the segregated funds and mutual funds are more known to the general public and regulators. Pooled funds are a little lower on the radar, but it's in the real world that's what group RSPs and defined contribution pension plans are utilizing.
And so what you're saying, like you gave me an example in the 2030 pooled fund. The day it became 2030 and you decided there'd be a deemed disposition at that day and you'd have to be tax consequences on it?
Well, what would happen is if there was no merger, the fund would be forced to wind up at that point and there would be those tax consequences.
Okay, and if there was a merger, there'd still be tax consequences?
It'd be deferred. So it's like in your RSP, for example, your contributions grow without incurring tax consequences. Only when you draw down to live off the money that you pay the tax as you draw it down. So we just want to put this on an equal footing. So because they're holding pooled funds, when they merge, there'd be the tax hit right away. So you would lose your whole deferral. But you're only, let's say, 65 when you retire. You might live to 95. So that pool of money you have when you hit 65, that's what you're going to draw down the rest of your life and hopefully invest some of it to pay off the taxes as well, but to keep funding your retirement. So if you were in a regular mutual fund at that point, you can just draw down the money. You wouldn't have had a tax hit, but because there's the pooled fund interposed, you have a tax hit.
Interesting. You learn something every day on the Finance Committee.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How much time do I have left, Mr.
You are okay for another 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Youssef, thank you for your testimony. In the Budget Implementation Act, there's also a lot of protections for unpaid interns. Your comments on that, because I believe you did an interview in the Toronto Star regarding that as well.
Yeah, we've been a strong advocate that there have been a number of course, documentation about the exploitation of unpaid internship. And I'm honored and pleased to see the government have listened to, of course, a presentation has been made to actually close this. Internship is an integral part of giving young people an opportunity to gain skills, but there's no clear benefit as to those who have taken advantage of this opportunity to keep exploiting young people. We hire interns in Canada. They come, sort of CLC, they come in the summertime. And we establish, of course, a mechanism to pay them properly and make sure they have an opportunity to not only earn an income, but also to gain experience at the same time. There have been, of course, a lot of stories documented in regard to how this exploitation has been really at the detriment of young people really getting a good opportunity. And I think it's good that the government is fixing this piece of in the Canada Labour Code going forward. I think it will be an impetus for the province, of course, to share some of the experience and hopefully amend their code accordingly to bring about the same protection for young people who are getting an internship at the provincial level and territorial level.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I interned as a younger Canadian, and there's a lot of benefits to internships, but at the same time, we got to protect young Canadians to make sure they don't get taken advantage of from employers. Chandra, you said that the recommendation is for an advance notice is for 1 week. Can you elaborate on a little bit more on why it just 24 hours to 1 week seems kind of a drastic jump?
Right, but we think that the federal standards should meet or exceed the best provincial standards, and the best provincial standard is Saskatchewan, which requires 1 week written notice of your schedule and of any changes to your schedule. And 24 hours just isn't enough for a number of things. Like if you book a medical appointment, a lot of establishments will require 48 hours notice. or you have to pay a fee. So if your employer calls 24 hours before and says, we need you to come in, and you're not allowed to say no, then you've incurred the fee and you don't get to have your medical appointment.
That's a really good practical example. I just feel like the 7 days in 2017, where things are changing like that and e-commerce is taking over, that corporations have to be adaptive, and so do employees. And so there's got to be a happy medium there. But you gave an excellent example on how even I had to cancel an appointment last week and I got charged for it. So although my boss didn't give me notice.
And I'm giving you notice. Your time's up.
Thank you.
Mr. Albus.
I want to thank all of our witnesses for your attendance and your expertise today. I'm going to start with Dr. Lee. Dr. Lee, the Conservative Party and our members have been voicing that there is not enough focus by the government, in particular with seniors and our aging demographics. They chose not to have a Minister of Seniors, which allows for some of these issues in public policy where there are many different areas, everything from employment to healthcare and to other social needs, including obviously the finance being the pensions system being a very important part of it. How do you think, you've mentioned a lot of concerns in terms of our demographics, but how do you think this gray tsunami will impact our national finances going forward?
Thank you. There have been, I've mentioned it, I'll just reference it again, there have been a plethora of studies in the past 10, 15 years by very prestigious and authoritative institutions. The World Bank has published on this, the IMF, the OECD. And first and foremost, with the exit of such large numbers from the workforce, it's going to slow down GDP. And that's going to reduce the flow of revenues to federal and provincial governments. And this has been modeled and it's been shown by these various forecasting agencies. Finance Canada has studies internally, I'm told, that show this. So the first and foremost, the impact is going to show up in reduced economic growth and reduced revenues down the road. I mean, that's the first problem. And the second problem is because the dependency ratio is collapsing, and I mean collapsing, from the late 60s where it was around 7, somewhere around 7 workers for every dependent or retiree, it's going to get down to about 2.4. I guess I have an understanding of a basic arithmetic. And to think that there's going to be 2.4 young people supporting one of me is a scary thought, because we're living a lot longer. And as we get above that 75 point, and the break point is somewhere between 75 and 80, when healthcare costs start to absolutely skyrocket. And so something's going to give. That's why the OECD is predicting using very apocalyptic language. So is the IMF. And I don't think that we are even, I've talked to colleagues in the university and they say, oh, yes, okay, revenues will be down a little bit tighter. I don't think it's going to be like that. I think every forecast I've looked at is going to be that it's going to be far worse than that. And there's things that we can do to mitigate it, such as I said, trying to keep seniors in their home and trying to keep seniors working longer. Very quickly, Fred Vitesse, the chief economist of Morneau Chapelle, I've met him at several pension conferences. He's a brilliant individual, one of the leading authorities on this, says our pension policies are incoherent. Private pension plans allow you to retire at 55, OAS is 65, CPP is 60 to 70. We could start by standardizing and adopting, say, the CPP model and amend OAS and the Tax Act for private and pension plans. So there's things that we can do to mitigate this tsunami that's coming.
And so one part would be a structural change across for pensions. Obviously, the federal government touches a lot of touch points with old age security and CPP and guaranteed income supplement, but lots of provinces also have different pension legislation. So does this need to be a whole, not just of government, but governments in Canada? Exactly,
okay. Yes. I mean, I've mentioned this, I mean, I think several people have said this. Why is it that we have to draw down our RSP or our pension at 71? Why can't I keep working to 75 without drawing down my pension and allowing myself to top my pension up because I'm postponing it? Things like that. It's completely arbitrary, the 71. And Dr. Mintz has written about this as well. The government's going to get its take when the person eventually retires or passes away. The money will, it's not as if the money's being evaded. It'll eventually come into the federal government. But that's another area that should be looked at.
Okay, how much time do I have?
2.5.
Well, I'm concerned because if we look at Japan, Japan has had an aging demographics coupled with a slowing economy, and they've been, I believe, perpetually below economic numbers for quite a long time, which creates a lot of issues on government. So I've been asking for, and I do believe the Parliamentary Budget Office has been working towards getting better data to break out whether it be our national debt, but not just by the federal government, but also by provinces and then demographics, so we can start to see where the real critical points will be. I do know in the last Parliament, some members of Parliament had discussed, and some senators as well from the Maritimes had discussed perhaps there being some structural changes. Does it make sense to have multiple health authorities, rather than trying to harmonize and work together? So are these some of the strategies that we're going to need to take? Because, again, if you look at Japan, it's very difficult to boost growth to what people traditionally view as being normal, which is post-World War II numbers. So what are some of the things we can do?
First off, in terms of using Japan as an excellent example, because it is according to the OECD, it is aged more rapidly and has an older age distribution than any other country in the world. So there's differences between Japan and us because, of course, we are still growing. We are bringing in immigration. Japan isn't. So there are differences. But nonetheless, if you want to look at the impact of aging on the economy, Japan is an excellent example. But to answer your question, I think I don't want to be simplistic, but I think there's very broadly, very big picture. There's two things we should be doing. You as parliamentarians should be saying, what can we do to keep people in the workforce longer?
Okay.
The idea of Freedom 55 is a fraud. And we're allowing people to leave the workforce when we need more people in the workforce, and creating the problems that creates on employer pensions. We shouldn't even allow a pension plan to allow someone to retire before 60 or even 65. OECD, if I can remind everybody, is urging every Western government to push up minimum age of pensionable retirement to 68.
Thank you all. Mr. Dussault.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your appearance here today. I'd like to talk about the changes to the Canada Labour Code. I'm happy to have your perspective, because when the officials came to present the relevant clauses about the Canada Labour Code, they seemed to be saying everything's rosy and that the consultations had been perfect, everyone got along just fine, everything was great according to them. But here we're hearing solutions that could improve certain clauses of the bill, so I'm pleased to have that. And that'll allow us, during clause-by-clause consideration, to bring forth amendments. The only thing I didn't hear you talk about, and maybe the question's for Mr. Yusuf or someone else who can answer, Ms. Dandy, with regards to the documentation required under 206.7, paragraph 5, for victims of family violence. It says that the employer can ask, after the leave has been taken for family reason, can ask for documentation to prove that there was a good reason to take that leave. Is that a concern for you, or is that not a problem? I don't know which one of you would like to answer.
If that's okay. So obviously, sometimes it's difficult for people who are experiencing domestic violence to provide the traditional kinds of documentation, and we don't want requirements for documentation to impose barriers on people who are already going through very challenging situations. So you don't want to do things like require a restraining order or something like that, because there are many different types of domestic violence, and people experience it in different ways, right? and have different needs. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Ideally, you would want, employers shouldn't require that kind of evidence, certainly not before. So after the fact, if they can provide, say, a letter from a lawyer or a statement from a worker at a women's shelter, for example, or another sort of support service, as long as there's some flexibility in the type of documentation, but we would prefer really that there not be a requirement. That's the kind of stuff, though, that I think we could work out in regulations as opposed to put it in the legislation per se. But so I'm giving you a bit of a mixed answer. If you're going to have it in there, then after the fact makes more sense than requiring it up front.
Est-ce que vous souscrivez ces commentaires?
Do you agree with those comments?
And that the requirement for documentation be put in the regulations, not be part of the legislation. We agree that it could be very challenging for a survivor leaving a violent situation and doing the basic tasks that she needs to do to make herself safe to access documentation. For example, if she just needs to go out and open a bank account or things like that. I mean, the purpose of the leave is to do those basic tasks, which may take an hour or two at a time. So. Yeah, we agree with the CLC on that and recommend that it be in the regulations.
Puis encore peut-être sur.
Perhaps it was you, Ms. Pasma, who talked about this. Among the many reasons that an employer can require more flexible working conditions, the reasons are so broad that employers can refuse under just about any circumstance. You said we should rely on other jurisdictions, especially other jurisdictions in Canada. To your mind, is there another jurisdiction that has a higher standard? Let's say restrictions or excuses that are more limited for the employer. Could you guide us toward a jurisdiction that's more adequate on this in this regard?
That has it specifically in their labor code that an employee can ask for flexible work arrangements, probably because it's not that meaningful. Employees do ask for flexible work arrangements all the time. The bigger problem is actually employees who are being made flexible when they don't want to be flexible, so workers who are casual or temporary, on-call or contract. And the labor code really needs to be updated to deal with that situation, especially when people are being kept as temporary employees in permanent positions, so they never get to be permanent, even though they are really doing a permanent job.
Puis peut-être sur une question très reliée.
Now, on the related question, whoever can answer, I'm getting back to a leave for domestic violence. Does this exist elsewhere? Does it exist in any of the provinces? And is it comparable to the clauses we have here? Are they comparable to those of provinces?
The Labour Code provides for domestic violence, and it provides for paid leave in domestic violence. The Ontario government has recently, of course, had broad consultative process going on regarding updating their employment standards and the Labour Code. And currently before the legislature, there is, of course, recommendations from the committee. And very shortly, the government will, of course, be announcing the position they'll be taking in regard to paid versus unpaid domestic violence. The point we've enunciated is that it's good that the government has recognized this, of course, and in the code, the federal code, and providing, of course, for time off. The challenges, of course, is that for individuals who are facing domestic violence, you're going to perpetuate the situation quite often they're in. We can see from other jurisdictions, certainly from the Manitoba, that you certainly can achieve paid. In other countries where this, of course, have been adopted and been in place longer than Canada, Australia, for an example, they do provide for domestic violence, and more importantly, on average, when people have to exercise this leave, it's only about 2.5 days is they're ever used in regard to situations they need time off from. So I think, again, our argument is it's good that the government is moving in the right direction, but that we would prefer that they look at the importance of addressing, of course, the need for providing paid leave for individuals that may be required to deal with domestic violence.
We'll have to end it there. Mr. Fergus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank all the witnesses who are appearing here today. In your own way, you all talked about the importance of social cohesion in Canada, and there are many ways to achieve that objective. Not only prosperity, but the way we treat people who are less fortunate. And I'm not talking about only income, but less fortunate in other ways, less than all of us here around the table. Mr. Davis, I'd like to start with you. You pointed out through your anecdotes and your analysis the importance of ensuring that there is some flexibility in the Labour Code so that people who suffer from chronic diseases such as multiple sclerosis can find their situation reflected in the Canada Labour Code. I'm wondering if you could elaborate about the importance of giving the dignity of work to people with chronic diseases like MS and how these changes are important. If you could, too, are there other solutions we should be looking at in upcoming amendments? You have the floor.
In regards to dignity, I would comment that what we hear from people living with MS and other episodic illnesses is that they want to work. They want to have that satisfaction of being able to make a contribution. And many people who reflect on whether, if they're currently unable to work and they reflect back, that's often their first comment is that I wish I could have kept working longer. If you have MS, there's a 60% unemployment rate. So this social side of being able to make a contribution is very important. The current system it's a binary switch. Right? Either you are in or you're out. And one of the additional recommendations we would certainly have is making sickness benefits flexible. So in my opening comments, I spoke about a job sharing, work sharing program. In addition to that, sickness benefits, right now you have to take them all in one lump sum. If for an episodic illness, there could be a few days where you're unable to make a contribution, but when you're in remission, you're able to come back to work. So the rigidity of that particular program is very difficult for individuals in order for them to make feel like they're making a positive contribution.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Davis.
Thank you very much. Mr. Youssef, Ms. Smallman, you also talked about the importance of changes to recognize the situation of domestic violence and have provisions in the Canada Labour Code to address that scourge. I'd like to get back to a question similar to the one I put to Mr. Davis. There's the fact that to ensure that there is some dignity that is guaranteed for all employees, all Canadians. Those who end up in these situations, and they're usually women, should have some flexibility so that they can keep their jobs. Could you elaborate on that, please?
The ability to go to work and deal with reality, which we all enjoy, is paramount in our lives. And when individuals are going through situations such as domestic violence, it's critical that their workplace be as supportive as possible. But in addition to that, that it becomes a safe place where they can go to escape the violence. Because too often the abuser will reach right into the workplace, and if employers are not cognizant of the fact, then they screen the call, somebody call up, and you just leave a situation where it's in a violent home, and then of course only to have the person on the phone disturbing you from your work. So these are changes are the recognition of this as an issue that has to be dealt with in the workplace, and of course in the regulation there will have to be other things that will have to be dealt with. So the employer truly provide a safe environment for those who are experiencing domestic violence to be able to ensure that the workplace does not become another place where they're going to experience that. I think from the work we have been doing, working with our affiliates across the country, trying to raise consciousness of Canadians, our own members, employers at the bargaining table, I think there's obviously recognition and change that are going on, but as you know, the statistics on domestic violence is quite sad. Despite all that we have done, we haven't done enough, and I want to be blunt, for the most part, this violence are coming from men. We've got to do a better job, and I think as a society we've got to figure out a way to elevate this conversation, because in 2017, when they look at the number of women that are still experiencing domestic violence, I think the reality is that we haven't done a good job. And this is about not just the federal government, it's also about the provincial and territorial government working together as to how we can deepen the conversation, but also to change attitudes and behavior, so this reality does not continue to be part of our society going forward. This is one small step, but it's an important step. And more importantly, we need to make sure we get it right, because it can be, of course, a vehicle for the province and the territory to follow that's not yet in that domain.
J'espère, Monsieur le Président, j'ai une petite question à poser.
I have a brief question. Thank you, Mr. Youssef. Professor Lee, thank you for your analysis. I certainly share your concerns about the balance to be struck between the active population and seniors. It's very important. You raised the question, and you cited the example of Japan. You did add one thing. You said Japan may not be an excellent example when it comes to immigration, because we know that the rate of immigration in Japan is very small for various reasons. And that's one of the reasons they're in the situation they're in, whereas in Canada we chose another path. We chose to bet on immigration. I'm here because my parents came to Canada, and I know many people are in the same situation, Mr. Kamich and many other members around this table. This
for compensating in part of the shortage that we're going to have of a workforce.
Thank you for the question. I really do believe that this is a very important issue, and I believe it's an important part of the solution. Yes, we are a nation of immigrants. Of course, we all are, as former Prime Minister Mulroney said many times. My own father came from England. My mother's parents came from Scotland, from the Highlands. I think we go back one or two generations, we've all come from somewhere else. But that wasn't the issue, the question you asked, and I'll be very brief, Mr. Chair. Economic immigration, and I won't get into the issues of other types of immigration, but economic immigration is very, very important. And you probably receive conflicting advice, because some statisticians say, look, it's not going to solve our problem because you bring in the same profile of the population. That suggests we should be weighting towards younger economic immigrants rather than older economic immigrants.
Thank you all. Mr. Polyev, we're going to 5-minute rounds.
My question is for Dr. Lee. He was speaking about the economic and financial challenges associated with a massive wave of retirements, the gray tsunami, as he called it. And I want to ask him about what I believe is an accounting problem, one for which I don't have a solution, but one that I believe incentivizes governments to make short-term decisions, short-term financial decisions at long-term cost. Let me give you one example. We have in our registered retirement savings plans a rule that requires that retired people convert their RRSPs into RIFs, income funds, and that they begin withdrawing at a fairly precipitous pace funds out of their RIFT so that they can have it as income, and then it would be so that it can be taxed. Now, there is no long-term financial benefit to the government in requiring these withdrawals, because the money is going to be taxed later anyway. If the person were to keep that money till they turn 85, and then take it all out, well, they would be taxed all in that 85th year of their life. By virtue of the fact that they were forced to take it out at 71, they are taxed, it is true, earlier, but they are not taxed more. Now, why do governments do this? And the answer is that if a government today were to get rid of the mandatory withdrawal rule, that government would have to take all of the revenue loss, and then some future government would get a revenue gain. So 10 years down the road, people would start to take that money out, and it would be taxed in some future government. So no present-day government would want to accept the revenue loss of allowing that deferral to go on. Even though there's no long-term cost to the Crown, there is a short-term cost to the political government of the day. When it comes to expenses and obligations governments accept, if, for example, the government were to settle a lawsuit to pay out millions of dollars over 3 decades, under our accounting system, the full cost of that decision is actually borne in the year the decision was made, not in the year the money is paid out. And that's to ensure that a present-day government has to account for the financial costs of the future obligations it decides to take on. Is there some way that principle, which applies to expenditures and obligations, could be embedded in the accounting of tax revenue?
Go ahead.
I'll be very brief. I'm not a tax accountant at all. I am aware of the debate, the issue you're suggesting there. I really am aware of that, and I apologize. Sorry. I would just point out very quickly that I'm not sure those forecasts would in fact unfold in that way. That is to say that there would be a mass rush and people would go at a certain point. I'm just thinking of the retirement after universal retirement, mandatory retirement for professors was taken off about 5 years ago. People predicted that there would be huge numbers of professors working well into their 70s and 80s. The averages haven't changed at all.
I'll let Mr. Lee. I didn't see you before when you were trying to raise a point of order, Michael. So, if we can let Mr. Lee answer this question, then go to your point of order.
And so, to answer your question on the accounting side, if you're asking me about accrual accounting, a government accrual accounting in the public sector, that would be one, Mr. Poilievre, I believe that would be one solution, as opposed to using cash accounting. If I understood your question.
Mr. McLeod, you had a point of order earlier, and I didn't recognize you were raising your hand for a point of order, so go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I take offense to what Mr. Lee just said. He stated that everyone's come from some other country. I think as an Indigenous person, as an MP for a riding that represents Indigenous people, that's not a true statement, and we would have lots to say about that. I think maybe he should reconsider and retract that comment. Mr. Chairman.
Okay, you've made your point. If you want to add anything further, Mr. Lee.
Sure. MP McLeod is absolutely correct. I wasn't referring to First Nations peoples, Indigenous peoples. I was then referring to people that came from elsewhere.
Okay, Mr. Poilievre, we won't take that time away from you. Go ahead.
Thank you. And we do now have accrual accounting when it comes to the expenditures of the government. But I'm just wondering if there is a way that we can address in the tax system, account for in the tax system, decisions by governments that are made in the present but which have long-term revenue consequences. Let me give you another example. The government is proposing measures to penalize passive investment within Canadian-controlled private corporations. Now, that will force a lot of people to take their money out of their company and be taxed on it in the present, so that they can save for their retirement outside of the company. If that happens, yes, the government will get a short-term burst of revenue, but all of that money, which would have stayed in those companies and been taxed nevertheless later on when taken out, well, that will no longer be available 5, 10 years down the road as it would otherwise have been. In fact, in this case, even if there are no behavioral consequences to the policy decision, there will be a long-term revenue loss, because not only will the government not be able to tax that money down the road, any growth on that money will never have occurred and therefore will not be taxable either. So the government gets the benefit of a short-term burst of cash into its coffers, even though the long-term financial implications are negative for the Crown, and in this case it turns out for the taxpayer. You know, there ought to be some way that the accounting system can take into consideration the long-term loss of revenue that is a definitive result of a short-term tax measure decision.
I'll be very, very quick. I'm just searching my head for articles I've read, and I'm pretty certain that Professor Mintz has published something on this at the University of Calgary, and I promised the chair I will provide that article to the committee. I'm pretty certain he's looked at the financial consequences of specifically extending mandatory drawdown of RSPs at 71, and I'll provide it to the committee.
Okay, Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Davis, you talked about nurse practitioners and the changes that this will bring. For people with MS, and in particular who maybe don't live in city centers or in areas where they have, you know, even in big city centers, frankly, they might not have quick access to doctors. What does this mean in terms of members, again, with MS and getting the access to the types of tax credits or the filling out the forms for the government that will then enable them to kind of move through the next process and either receive a tax credit or whatever else they might need? What does that mean for your for those people who don't live in close proximity to a doctor or medical practitioner?
Thanks for the question, and I would agree in regards to the concerns in rural areas. We hear lots of stories of people with MS who sometimes have trouble finding the services they need. Therefore, this particular decision with the nurse practitioner to be able to assist in signing off on a particular portion of something like a disability tax credit is helpful because it would expedite the process. And the sooner someone with MS or a similar illness or a disability has access to the supports, the better.
Thank you. And have you found or have you heard feedback in terms of then access to nurse practitioners? Is this something that you think will help dramatically improve that, or do we still need to then work on making sure there's adequate nurse practitioners available as well?
I haven't heard that specific piece of feedback at the moment, so I can't comment on that.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. I believe Ms. Pasma, that you mentioned in terms of the regulation or the changes in terms of the time off for cultural Aboriginal practices. And we heard testimony from officials on this bill. I believe you said in your testimony, and if I wrote it down incorrectly, correct me, but that there should have been consultations done in terms of what constitutes in Aboriginal Indigenous practice. But we heard testimony from officials that said just that there were consultations done with the Indigenous community, and they provided examples of things, but they were not limited to. And my colleague, Mr. McLeod, asked questions about how this would result in practice. But the testimony we've heard is those consultations absolutely did happen, and the wording around this was done specifically as a result around those consultations. Are you suggesting that that didn't take place?
Of course not. And
Okay.
I don't know who was consulted.
Okay.
Obviously, the range of practices that are represented in the bill are very limited. The rest will be seen in the regulations. And we hope that there will be consultations around the regulations too in terms of what practices make it in. Our larger concern is actually around the documentation of the status of Aboriginal. which is highly contentious, and I would hope that whatever consultations have taken place and whatever consultations will take place in the future are very broad, because that's one of the most contested issues. And it tends to be women in particular who have been excluded from having their Indigenous status recognized, and therefore who have greater difficulty claiming their Indigenous rights. And we don't want to see employers being put in the position of deciding whether or not someone is Indigenous if they don't have Indian status, for instance, or if they are Métis, if they can prove whether or not they meet the criteria for being Métis.
Okay, thank you. That clarification is important. And then in terms of, well, I think both the CLC and QP spoke about this, so whomever wants to jump in is fine. But in terms of the documentation for, let's say, an issue of family violence, and we talked about with Mr. Dussault's questions, in terms of the documentation after the fact, and I appreciate that you both have said that after the fact is certainly better than before. So when officials appeared, again, these types of questions were raised, and the response from the officials were that the intention, and I'm paraphrasing, but the intention of these changes were really to ensure that those victims or direct family members of those victims could access quick kind of work flexibility, and that the idea is that if there was like a longer term or a larger issue needed, that those types of things could be dealt with the employer. But really the intention is that this is a quick access to time off to either seek medical attention, mental health, those types of things, and that's really the intention. So with that being said, and the documentation coming after the fact, can you see maybe the rationale of why, although I hear the concerns about documentation, but to access that quick flexibility is really the important aspect here?
And the Labour Code coverage is broad across the country. Not every employer have the same experience and will not have the same understanding as to the intent of the law. And I think the government will have to provide some very cohesive guidelines that would ensure we have continuity application across the country. So if you're living in BC and you work for an employer, but if you live in Ontario, could be the same employer, but yet the interpretation internally may not have been communicated to you. And quite often what workers are dealing with is their frontline supervisors, who they may have to engage with in regard to their needs. And I think it's critical in some industrial workplace that there's sensitivity also to the fact that you're talking to somebody about an issue that you may not want to share with them. So clearly this is going to something that we're going to have to work with. I don't suggest that the employers are not cooperative or supportive, but I think we're going to have to work in a very intensive way to ensure the intent and the application actually cover the same ground, and more importantly, that people don't have to be put in a situation that is not tolerable or expected in instances where they need the support, but also need to get the time off as quickly as they can.
Thank you both. Mr. Albus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to actually go to PMAC to start here. Thank you for your presentation here today. Now, I do certainly understand the importance, and I think things like target date funds are a really welcome innovation, because, again, the more that we can get people just to simply put money away for retirement that fits into a balanced risk approach based on their age, I think is a very smart strategy. However, like any proposition, there's always going to be additional costs, and people might be critical, and I think it's important to always listen to many different voices and say, if a prospectus exempt pooled fund decided to start out with a particular asset allocation, why should we allow them to merge with these other ones and to not pay their taxes at that point? Why throw these exemptions on? So what would you say to someone who raised that?
Well, I think what I'd say is I'd sort of take a step back and say with prospectus mutual funds, you're allowed to do that, and the tax code has provided for that for a long time. So I sort of turn it around and say, why would we distinguish from one vehicle to the other? If it's good enough for one, it's good enough for the other. And that question raises a whole host of other issues that PMAC has views on as well, which we'll raise in due course. But it's the pooled fund itself, first of all, comes cheaper to the insurance company, so they are able to charge less to the end investor, which obviously for retirement savings is desirable. It increases the amount that you have at the end of the day. And when you have a merger, typically you have to have a unitholder vote to approve it, especially where there's real differences between the funds. So if you had a target date fund that has a very specific investment objective that would merge into, say, a Canadian equity fund, if it was a mutual fund, you'd be guaranteed to have an investor vote because the investment objectives are radically different. In seg funds, you don't have the same rules. But you do have what they call a free exit in that situation. So if the investor doesn't like the merger proposal, they can always redeem out of the fund. And one of the reasons why we often propose fund mergers as opposed to just terminating the fund is if we terminate the fund or if you redeem out your money, it's the same tax consequence. Mm-hmm. The one shot you have to defer the tax is if you have a fund merger. So that by offering up a fund merger as a possibility, the investor really has control of their destiny. They have the widest array of choices, and they can decide, okay, I want to trigger my tax now, so I'll vote against it, or I'll just withdraw my money, or I'd rather defer it off and see how this new investment does.
Okay. So can you give another example, because you have talked about the target date funds, but can you give us another example of maybe where it started with one situation and now, and I don't disagree that we should be somewhat agnostic because we don't want to treat two different classes when they both have the same focus. But again, the rules are the rules, and they were designed for that way. So I think people need to understand, what kind of situations would then create the situation where the government should exempt them.
Okay. So basically, there's two levels of expenses that an investor in a fund product pays. So there's the management fees and there's operating expenses. And typically, though it's changing a little bit these days, the operating expenses, the fund manager will charge their costs back to the fund. So when you've heard the expression management expense ratio. So let's say your management expense ratio is 2.14%. 2% is usually the management fee, and the 0.14 are these operating expenses. So we try very hard to lower that 0.14 on a regular basis. So the idea is in a merger, let's say we had started a fund, it might be performing well, but for whatever reason, investors haven't been interested in it. But because there's a lot of fixed costs to running a fund, but if you have a small investor base, you can't really disperse it across a wide number of investors. So the expense ratio tends to go up. And very often you'll see mergers being proposed, even on successful funds, when the expense ratio has gotten high, because it's not really a good deal for investors anymore. They might still be making money, but it's very inefficient because of all those expenses. So you might want to merge two mandates to try and pull it across it and lower those expenses. And deal with it that way.
So if this...
it's typically about efficiency.
So if this request doesn't go forward, though, what does that mean? Does that just mean that more people will just simply choose not to open up these perspectives exempt pooled funds?
Well, there's a concern that if it doesn't go forward, as people get the tax hit from if they merge, that they'll find it a less than desirable vehicle. And the problem is then people will either try to manage their own portfolio without having the expertise, which will likely result in less savings at retirement, or they might not invest at all. They might invest in GICs, say, and you can't really retire off the rate of return today you get on a GIC, for example. And it might dissuade people from using target date funds, even though around the world that's becoming sort of the default investment option of choice for people saving for retirement.
We'll have to end it there. From your perspective, would this be an issue of fairness in taxation? Seems the word that flies around here these days.
Yes, I think it is a question of fairness, because it's a question of treating the same investor getting treated the same way regardless of the vehicle, given what they're trying to achieve, which is retirement savings.
Okay, Mr. Sabara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Quickly, first to Mr. Lee, actually. Immigration is important, and we know the demographics in the country, and that's one of our biggest headwinds. Every economist from left, right, center agrees with that. It's great to see that our government, announced our immigration targets for the next couple of years, and we're increasing those targets, and that's something that will offset some of the pressures. Not all of it, but something that will offset some of the pressures. And we do know that StatsCan reported this year, or this beginning of the year, there are now more 65 plus than there are younger folks than 15. You did have you mentioned two things about changes with regards to taking the year you can take CPP, or I think, can you just outline two of the measures that you would put in place with regards to providing workers flexibility and when they retire? Quickly, please.
I think you're referring to the reference I made to the chief economist, Fred Vitesse,
yes,
and the contradictions in our, actually he called it incoherent pension policy in Canada, because our existing policy contemplates 3 completely different retirement ages. Is that what you're referring to?
If you can just outline the policy without getting into the background, please.
Okay, sorry. Well, CPP offers a range between 60 and 70 under the recent changes, which were prudent. If you go below 65, you're actually penalized. If you go between 65 and 70, and a lot of Canadians still don't know this, you can actually push up your CPP by about 42% by pushing back the drawdown. Okay, OAS, you take it at 65 and that's it. And with company pension plans under the Tax Act, you can go as early as 55. And so what I was suggesting is that maybe we should look, you the members of Parliament, the Finance Committee, should look at recommendations to standardize one age of retirement, one model. And the CPP model, which offers a range between 60 and 70, so there's flexibility. You go before 65, you can choose to, but you're penalized. If you decide to push it back, you can enhance your pension. Seems to be a more reasonable and prudent policy than the arbitrary OAS of 65 or the insolvent, often insolvent private employer pension plan.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lee. To the Canadian Labour Congress, Mr. Hussain, welcome. Mr. Youssef, welcome. With regards to some of our changes we've made to the Labour Code and providing workers flexibility, how important is it to your members of other unions and other employees to have this flexibility for events in their life that they may have to deal with and we may not want to talk about sometimes, and we may not talk about on a daily basis, but just how important are some of these changes to the Labour Code and to the measures that we put in place for workers out there today?
I think that these changes have been put forward. They're welcome. I guess, as you know, the section of the code that where many of these provisions are coming from is Part 3, which is about 60 years outdated. When the Archer's report was submitted quite some time ago, over a decade ago, he had reviewed, of course, and make some significant recommendation about how to upgrade Part 3 of the code. So while this is only part of those recommendations, I think we've got a long way to go, but it certainly are going to deal with the variety, of course, challenges that individuals have from different communities in the workforce, but at the same time recognizing that we can do different things to help individuals meet their needs in the code, and I think it's a good step in the right direction. Of course, my colleagues, of course, from CUPE have put forward some suggestions how we can improve these provisions, but I think it's welcome because, of course, it's been long overdue, because in absence of having these provisions in the code, it means that most workers, to a large extent, couldn't exercise these rights, even if they wanted to, because there was no legal context for them to even ask their employer to give them that, and if the employers were fortunate to do it, it was an arrangement they made by themselves, or unless it was in their collective agreement. So I certainly welcome most of the recommendations, but of course, the Harry Archer's report was much more comprehensive, and I hope we'll get to that sometime in the new year.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Youssef. Again, welcome. To the folks at the Portfolio Management Association of Canada, my colleague, Mr. Gruwell, has asked a bunch of questions. I'd appreciate to take this conversation further in another venue or another situation, just because there seems to be a lot to wrap our hands around, my head around there in terms of the tax treatment on pool versus segregated and so forth. But I do want to make that comment. To the MS Society of Canada, we know that, my understanding is that the incidence of MS is the highest in Canada in the entire world.
That is correct.
In the entire world?
Canada has the highest rates of MS in the world.
How do we ensure folks that have this, I can use the word debilitating, but this condition, are able to remain in the labor force and remain productive individuals? And how are we doing on that front, if I can ask that?
There's work to be done. In terms of, as I mentioned earlier, related to the binary switch challenge, where people who have an episodic illness, when they can't work, they need support, but when they're able to work, they should be able to work and make an impact. Right? And for those who are unable to work at all, we have feedback around the disability tax credit as well. We think it should be refundable. We think someone with MS shouldn't have to check a box every year that says they still have MS, because it's Canada's disease, we don't know the cause, and we don't have a cure yet.
We'll have to cut it there. Just on that point, Mr. Davies, you mentioned in your brief, make income tax legislation and regulations consistent and improving the parameters around the definition of disability. Do you want to expand on that a little bit? What has to be done to do that? I get your point on you had to prove it every year, which is a little ridiculous.
Yeah, well, thank you. In regards to the definitions, we were really pleased with the accessibility legislation consultations, and our recommendation there is very clear. Include episodic illness in the definition of disability. By simply doing that, the program opportunities are open by virtue of more people being able to access those programs.
Okay, thank you. And just to the Professional Management Association, what would be the specific amendment from your point of view that would deal with the problem of certain pooled funds? And if you don't,
sure,
I'll take
yeah.
your answer, but you
Yeah.
can always send us a note to that
Okay.
effect.
Okay. Yeah, we have sent a note directly to the Department of Finance on this, but there's a specific section in the income tax that that covered the merger of segregated insurance product funds and mutual funds, and we're just asking that cover pooled funds also.
So could you pull up that note and send it to the clerk of the committee, please, Katie?
Happy to do that. Thank you.
Okay. Then with that, thank you to all the witnesses and your answering our questions. We'll suspend for a moment and bring up panel 2. Meeting suspended. Panel 2 on further discussions on the Budget Implementation Act, Bill C-63. In this panel, we'll start with Michael MacDonald, Executive Director, Canadian Alliance of Student Associations. Welcome to all the panelists. The floor is yours. Michael, we'll try to keep it to about 5 minutes if we could.
Absolutely.
And just to inform you, we do have to suspend this discussion at 6:30 because we have a motion, at 6:15 because we have a motion to deal with. Okay.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Chair, esteemed committee members and fellow witnesses, and members of the gallery. My name is Michael MacDonald, and I'm Executive Director of the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations, otherwise known as CASA. Thank you for your invitation to speak about Bill C-63. Broadly speaking, CASA was pleased to see the continued investments in students in Budget 2017, and we were especially encouraged by new supports for First Nations and Inuit learners, expanded access to grants for students with dependents and part-time students, and new rules on unpaid internships. For the remainder of my time, I am going to be focusing on the proposed amendments on unpaid internships, which is part of this bill. This move fits with the broader efforts to make Canadian workplaces more modern, inclusive, and effective. And we applaud, for example, the framework announced a few days ago to fight harassment, sexual violence in the public service and in federally regulated workplaces. Tens of thousands of students work in federal government jobs and federally regulated sectors each year. Alongside all their colleagues, they deserve a safe and respectful workplace that allows them to thrive. For the same reason, we support Bill C-63's proposed changes to ban uncompensated internships. At CASA, we are firm supporters of quality work experience for students. Recent research links participation in co-op programs with higher pay and better jobs after graduation. Surveyed students who did co-ops as part of their studies give their overall post-secondary education experience better reviews than those who did not, and employers also speak highly of the skills and job readiness of co-op graduates. While we know that the quality of work experience pays off for students and employers, uncompensated experiences do not. An American study found that far more graduates who did unpaid internships did not land jobs as compared to those who did do paid internships. Indeed, an unpaid experience did virtually nothing to improve job prospects, according to a recent study by the Canadian Internship Association. The likely explanation is simple. When an employer is invested in the experience, that they give the student more attention, more responsibilities, and more opportunities. Ultimately, we would like all internships experiences to be paid. However, we do recognize that compensation in the form of credit is better than no compensation at all. And Bill C-63 proposes to end unpaid internships in federally regulated sectors, except when those internships are part of formal education programs. We support this move, and as its important measure to promote high-quality work experiences, safety, and fairly compensate young workers. We recognize that, like paid internships, quality is generally also higher for work experiences that are built into formal post-secondary education programs, and we support the Budget 2017's promises to ensure that all interns, including those working for credit and formal programs, receive labor standard protections. Moreover, we think that it's important to highlight that unpaid interns tend to be far more prevalent in fields that are dominated by women. We think this is particularly problematic and something that we hope that this bill addresses. Another important consideration is for students from low-income backgrounds who have less flexibility when it comes to choosing between their experience and that might help them now and paying their bills. While we are pleased with the steps taken by the budget, to protect interns. Therefore, we will continue to be advocating the federal investment in new paid work opportunities for students. And this is why we're a big supporter of some of the work integrated learning opportunities that have been presented most recently. We'll continue to support high-quality, compensated student work experiences and are pleased to see the changes in the bill presented, and we think it's moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Turning then to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Ms. McInturf, and I'm not sure if I got that right, Kate?
Perfect.
Senior Researcher at the National Office for CCPA. Go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Kate McInturf, and I'm a Senior Researcher for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to speak today. The government's decision to include gender-based analysis in the federal budget is an important step forward for gender equality, and, as I argued in my pre-budget submission, for our economy. Budget implementation bills are an important moment for the government to act on that analysis. To date, the analysis presented in both Budget 2017 and the Fall Economic Update identify how men and women are affected differently by, for example, tax policy. And I was very pleased to see the Fall Update take note of the negative impact on women of income splitting and income sprinkling. It is important, however, to ensure that the analysis actually forms the basis for action and better policy. That is to say, our government policies need to be designed with the analysis in mind. The scope of Bill C-63 is understandably narrow. However, I would like to take this opportunity to demonstrate how gender-based analysis can make the government's policies more effective and go further in setting us down the path to gender equality. I'm going to speak specifically to the issue of leave for victims of domestic violence. In the 2017 budget's gender statement, the government recognized that, quote, women and girls are more likely than men to experience poverty, violence, and harassment, noting that, quote, women are more likely than men to experience the most severe forms of self-reported spousal victimization. The government's decision to implement leave for victims of domestic violence is a very welcome step in addressing the relationship between economic insecurity and susceptibility to domestic violence. However, a deeper analysis suggests that there are two further steps that need to be taken to ensure that this policy achieves its goal. Bill C-63 provides an excellent opportunity to take those steps. First, leave for victims of domestic violence needs to be paid. The evidence is clear that when women remain in violent settings and return to those settings, it is because they cannot afford to leave. A study from the University of British Columbia found that survivors of intimate partner violence experienced financial hardship as a result of that violence, regardless of their income status prior to leaving their abusive partner. That is to say, this has an impact on women from all economic groups. That financial hardship continued for years after they had left the violent setting. In the short term, when a woman leaves a violent setting, they face immediate financial challenges. One of the primary reasons given by women in shelters for returning to a violent household is that they cannot afford housing. Additionally, women with young children fear that if they are unable to financially support themselves and their children, those children may be apprehended by Child and Family Services. This not only means the tragedy of a victim of violence being separated from her children, but in small communities this can also result in the children being placed with, for example, a relative of the violent partner, potentially putting the children at further risk. The cost of lost work, lost wages, and lost productivity are significant. Just as Canada estimates the cost of lost wages due to domestic violence at $33.7 million annually. The cost of lost productivity to employers is an estimated $68.5 million annually. So what does this look like in the life of a survivor of domestic violence? When you leave an abusive spouse, you leave with almost nothing. Your children, a few suitcases at most. Not a fork, not a pot, not a chair, not a bed. When it's time to find housing, a survivor of domestic violence is starting from scratch. If she has children, she has the additional pressure of having to demonstrate to Child and Family Services that she can provide the basic necessities of life for her children. 3 days of wages, 3 days of paid leave for a woman making $25 an hour amounts to $600. That is enough to buy a mattress, a few plates, and a fork. That can make a world of difference in the life of a woman trying to build a new, safer life for herself and her family. The second recommendation I would make to ensure that domestic violence leave is effective is to eliminate the exclusion of those facing police charges. While I understand the desire not to extend this leave to someone who is charged with a violent crime, the exclusion of those who have been charged with domestic violence has the potential to exclude victims of abuse as well. This is because in some jurisdictions in Canada, the police practice the policy of automatic or dual charging. Automatic charging means that when police respond to a domestic violence call, they are required to charge those involved. This may result, and does in fact result, on occasion, in both the abuser and the victim of the abuse being charged. Automatic charging is intended to ensure that charging occurs and that the police response to domestic violence is robust. However, the result is that in some cases, victims are charged. Under the current proposal, under the legislation proposed here, those victims would be excluded from eligibility. The government is leading the way by recognizing the role of financial hardship and lost work in the lives who experience domestic violence. With these additional changes, the policy will set a new standard in supporting survivors of that violence. Further, it is precisely in implementing its policies that the government has the opportunity to put gender-based analysis to work and ensure that this analysis leads to action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Ms. Pohlman, Senior Vice President, National Affairs and Partnerships.
Canadian Federation.
Oh, Federation, yeah, that's what I said, wasn't it?
No, you Policy Alternatives.
Canadian Federation, sorry.
That's
Canadian Federation of Independent Business.
Thank you. Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. You should have a slide presentation on your tablet that I was hoping to walk you through over the next few minutes. CFIB is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization that represents more than 109,000 small and medium-sized businesses across Canada. Our members represent every region of the country, and they're found in every sector of the economy. Today, I want to touch on three aspects of Bill C-63. Introduction of flex work arrangements, addressing implications of the changes to the multiplication of the small business deduction and the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. Allowing employees the right to request flex work arrangements is unprecedented in Canada. Though only a small number of small businesses are federally regulated, provincial governments often implement similar changes, which then affects many more. We would argue that such legislation is actually not needed among small companies, because as you can see on slide 4, CFIB found that many small businesses owners offer some form of flexibility to help their employees balance work with other responsibilities. In fact, most do. Also, an Ipsos poll that was conducted earlier this year of those working in firms with fewer than 5 employees tend to be more satisfied with the flexibility given to address personal needs, as you can see on slide 5. In addition, the same employees are more likely to be very satisfied with their job in general compared to workers in larger firms.
Corrine,
sure.
if I could.
This is because most smaller employers already understand the importance of being flexible for employee retention, attracting new workers, and maintaining good work morale. Now, we believe this new legislation could pose several challenges for small business listed on slide 6. First would be the added administrative burdens such as reorganization of responsibilities to deal with employee requests and complying with regulations related to applications. Also, small businesses have limited resources to address any potential complaints or appeals processes that may result. Secondly, in some businesses, it is difficult for employers to offer certain types of arrangements such as working from home, which may also require specialized equipment, which can be quite costly for smaller firms. Thirdly, there can be significant costs in terms of temporary reductions in productivity due to disruptions of regular schedules. Moreover, many small businesses owners may have concerns regarding the fair treatment of other employees who may end up taking on extra work, causing resentment among coworkers. Finally, such legislation could lead to undue pressure on those small employers who are unable to accommodate the requests due to the nature of the work that they do, such as those in the transportation sector. Now, each business faces its own unique challenges, and it's why it's really best left with employers and employees to work out the most suitable arrangement between them. In our feedback to the government, which you can see on slide 7, we recommended that they not proceed with this legislation, and if they did, to potentially exempt smaller businesses. If they still plan to move forward, we had put forward a series of reasons that an employer should be allowed to refuse such a request, and we were pleased to see that many of those were incorporated into this legislation. However, we would like to see more than 30 days allotted to the employer to respond to a request. We had suggested 3 months, which is actually the amount that's allowed in the UK. And there were a few details in this bill on the enforcement of it and whether there will be an appeals process. These are areas that we remain concerned with at this time. Next, I want to talk about the multiplication of the small business deduction. And in Bill 63, there were changes made to the treatment of farmers and fishers selling to cooperatives so that they can remain eligible for the small business deduction. This was welcome clarification of the changes to this multiplication of the small business deduction, which was introduced earlier this year. But really more needs to be done with it. In Budget 2016, the government announced changes that would seem to be targeted at those who had created certain structures that enabled them to access the small business deduction more than once. But this now seems to be affecting more businesses than we were first led to believe. Under these new rules, active business income is not eligible for the small business deduction where a corporation earns that income from providing services or products to a direct or indirect interest. However, there's been no guidance given detailing what exactly an indirect interest is. So what does this mean? Well, it seems these new rules are having a broader impact on some small businesses, especially in rural areas. For example, we have one member from a small town in Alberta who owns a restaurant and purchases fresh produce from her father's farm. Our member has very limited amount of suppliers as there are a few other businesses in her area providing fresh produce, and so she purchases them from her father. However, under these new rules, any active business income generated from their arm's length relationship may no longer be eligible for the small business deduction, even though they both run completely separate businesses. The rules have also created additional administrative costs, as it requires increased effort to determine whether these rules apply to one's corporate earnings and to what extent. If a business is affected by the rules, it has been recommended to them that they keep two sets of accounting records, one for income not eligible for the small business deduction and one for the part that is. We believe more needs to be done to fully understand and address the impacts of these changes. Finally, I just want to mention the importance of the Canadian Free Trade Agreement and how pleased we are that this budget bill confirms the federal government's commitment to this important and historic agreement. As you can see on slide 10, it's clearly important to small businesses, but now the really hard work begins. We need the federal government to continue to play a key role in making sure that the progress is made on the agreement, and this starts with making sure the regulatory reconciliation...
Corrine, we'll get you to slow down again, if you could, please.
Oh.
They're trying to do translation, and they can't keep up.
Yep, very good. So, we need the federal government to continue to play the key role in making sure that progress is made on the agreement, and that starts with making sure the regulatory reconciliation and cooperation table is active and addressing key issues for small business. On slide 11, you can see the list of regulatory areas that require greater alignment across Canada and should be tackled quickly by the RCT. They include corporate registration and reporting, agricultural and transportation regulations, professionals and trade licensing, and workers' compensation and health and safety rules. We would encourage the federal government to use its influence in keeping discussions going and finding solutions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mars Discovery District, Mr. Mulville. Mulville Hill. You're going to pronounce that for me, Corey?
It's Mulville Hill.
Okay.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the invitation to come to speak to Bill C-63. My name is Corey Mulvihill, and I'm the lead executive, Policy and Public Affairs at Mars Discovery District. Mars is North America's largest innovation hub and is located in the heart of Canada's largest research cluster. We bring together entrepreneurs, educators, researchers, social scientists, investors, and corporate business experts under one roof, giving innovators what they need most: a home with connections to networks of talent, customers, and capital to grow and scale. Mars provides advisory and programming support to over 1,100 startup ventures, with our reach extending to partners and startups across Canada. Since 2008, Mars-supported ventures have raised $3.5 billion in capital and generated $1.8 billion in revenues. Today, they employ more than 6,100 people in knowledge economy jobs. Today, I'd like to speak specifically to the importance of nurturing a strong ecosystem of smart capital for Canada's emerging companies, particularly in our four focus areas, which include health, energy and environment, finance and commerce, and work and learning. A critical element to the success of these companies is their ability to access the right amounts and types of capital for their stage of growth, along with the effective advice that comes along with it. Budget 2017 will commit a further $400 million to stimulate growth in the Canadian venture capital ecosystem, following on the success of the previous government's Venture Capital Action Plan. As Canada's foundation of high-growth companies is accelerating, this investment through the Business Development Bank of Canada will play a critical role in ensuring that the momentum built through VCAP is to strengthen the VC ecosystem will continue, and these companies will be able to access capital during their critical stages of growth. While, according to the Canadian Venture Capital Association, this year's deal flow is set to outpace that of last year, the Canadian economy continues to face a systemic challenge in scaling firms to compete globally due to their undercapitalization. At Mars, we've used our role as a center of convergence in the innovation ecosystem to nurture the growth of capital in areas where we've seen gaps. This includes the management of the Investment Accelerator Fund, Ontario's most active seed fund, which has invested $52 million through 115 investments, and ArcTurn, which was launched to address a gap in funding for clean tech-focused companies. We look forward to the launch of the Venture Capital Catalyst Initiative, which will be a critical component in maintaining the momentum of Canada's venture capital ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nurse Practitioners Association of Ontario, Ms. Agnew and Ms. Timiansky.
Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Agnew, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Nurse Practitioners Association of Ontario. And with me here today is my colleague, Dr. Don Timiansky, a director on the board of MPAO. Don will shortly become the interim CEO of MPAO as I step down from this role after 5 years. We thank the Standing Committee on Finance for giving MPAO the opportunity today to provide feedback on Bill C-63. I will start by providing the committee with a short background about the role of NPs and MPAO. The Nurse Practitioners Association of Ontario is the professional association representing more than 3,100 nurse practitioners and NP students in Ontario. NPAO formed as an independent association representing NPs in 1973. NPAO has the largest percentage of voluntary members of any professional nursing association in Ontario. Nurse practitioners are registered nurses with advanced university education and experience who provide a full range of healthcare services to millions of patients across the province and across Canada. In Ontario, NPs can order and interpret all laboratory tests and most diagnostic imaging tests. NPs are also able to refer to specialists and admit, treat, and discharge hospital patients. And nurse practitioners can also do minor surgical procedures. Nurse practitioners are authorized to prescribe controlled drugs and substances, and this long-anticipated change to scope of practice now enables nurse practitioners as primary care providers to deliver all aspects of palliative and end-of-life care to their patients across the province, including medical assistance in dying for those eligible patients who request it. You will be interested to know that in Ontario, more than half of the practitioners on the ministry's MAID registry are nurse practitioners. Nurse practitioners work across the healthcare system in a wide variety of settings, including hospitals, family health teams, community health centers, NP-led clinics, long-term care centers. Nurse practitioners work with individuals and families from newborn babies to the elderly and serve many vulnerable and marginalized populations. So I'm just going to jump to our support of Bill C-63. As you know, Bill C-63 is an omnibus budget bill. And while we have not read all 275 pages of this bill, nor have we examined the many pieces of corollary legislation that will be amended if the bill is passed, we will keep our comments to a very high level. First of all, with respect to changes to Canada Labour Code, MPAO is pleased to see proposed changes to the Canada Labour Code that would provide Canadians with greater flexibility to take vacation time, add more bereavement days in the event of losing a loved one, and provide time to attend a traditional healing practice. In addition, we strongly support statutory time off for work to recover after experiencing family violence. This is a compassionate approach, and we know that all of those affected by family violence can be traumatized and need time to begin to heal. MPAO would, however, recommend that the statutory time off be with pay rather than as an unpaid leave. This would help to ensure that families are not penalized financially when they have already been through so much. Potentially, the bill could also go further in supporting families experiencing domestic violence. I speak in loving memory of Zara Abdeel, who was a nurse practitioner I had the honor of getting to know when she was an MP student. Zara was passionate about the care of the elderly. Sadly, she kept the fact that she was a victim of domestic violence from her colleagues and friends. In July of 2014, Zara had left her husband and had taken the boys to a women's shelter. She then sought legal assistance to pursue leaving her abusive husband. She worked as a nurse practitioner and was the family's sole breadwinner. Because it was determined that she earned too much money, Zara was denied access to free legal aid. This despite the fact that her husband controlled the family's bank account. Feeling that her options were limited, she and the boys returned to her husband. On November 29, 2014, Zara and her two children, Ferris and Zane, were killed by her husband. He later killed himself. On behalf of women like Zara Abdeel, MPAO implores the government We implore the government to ensure that all women are who are victims of domestic violence have access to free legal assistance. If this amendment cannot be made as part of Bill 63, we urge the government to find a way to enshrine this access into legislation. NPAO also supports measures within Bill 63 that seek to make our tax system more transparent and fair. Canadians pay tax to support the programs we hold near and dear, such as Medicare, affordable housing, and subsidized daycare. Those who make more should pay more. We support any amendments that would close tax loopholes that unjustly benefit the top income earners. Revenues from fair and equitable taxation could then go to improving the social determinants of health, thereby improving health for all Canadians. We also speak in favor of proposed amendments within Bill 63 that provide enhanced incentives to use geothermal energy. And finally, we'd like to thank the committee and thank the federal government for introducing changes in the omnibus bill that enable nurse practitioners to sign many federal forms. Despite the fact that nurse practitioners are independent assessors of patients, make a diagnosis, treat and manage health conditions, there are currently many federal forms that would not accept the signature of a nurse practitioner. This results in patients having to return to a clinic or healthcare setting, see a physician who may not know the client, and it causes additional expense and client for the system. We're thrilled with the omnibus changes in Bill C-63 that enable nurse practitioners across Canada to serve clients in a more expeditious and efficacious way. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Canadian Nurses Association and Nurse Practitioners Association of Canada for their extensive work and advocacy to make these changes a reality. Again, we thank you for the opportunity and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Agnew. And just a quick scan of your environmental scan. I hope the Minister of Health has that. You should send a copy of that to the Minister of Health.
Yes, we'll make sure that we do that. Thank you.
Then we'll turn to questions. Who we got in our list? Mr. Sabara. We'll go to 5-minute rounds.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Starting off with Mr. Mulvihill. That's all right. Can I just call you Corey? Would that be all right?
That sounds good.
Corey, our government has announced, the super cluster initiative, which has been applauded by many sectors, and I say many tech sectors. And I've been down to the Mars Discovery District in Toronto, and it's a lot of really, really exciting and great things are happening there. But in relation to the two initiatives we are undertaking within Bill C-63, the VCC and the second initiative where BDC and EDC, I think it's EDC, are coming in to assist, how important it is for government to partner with, if I call it the tech sector, but in innovation sectors, or sectors that innovation plays a crucial role. How important is that to drive innovation in Canada and commercialization as well?
So I guess I'd say it's important that government be seen as a supportive partner to the tech ecosystem. So I think our perspective is that it is the entrepreneurs who found and grow companies that should be in the driver's seat, but organizations such as ours and the government can be enablers to help grow the innovation ecosystem and to help grow those companies. So at Mars, we provide advisory services, we in some cases provide space, and the strategy is really about removing as many barriers as possible to allow those companies to grow and benefit the economy. And I would say the same to supports from the government. So the Venture Capital Catalyst initiative is one of those interventions where government, in partnership with the private sector, can address a gap that we've found to ensure that companies are able to access capital when they need it.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the CFIB, you didn't get to this, Corinne, on the slides that you provided, and thank you for the slides. The Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which, I think reducing barriers, when we say bilateral or multilateral, we often think about outside of Canada and with our international partners, but also there exists barriers within our great and beautiful country that we have. And I just wanted to get your feeling on how important the CFTA is for your members, and for your members to be able to whether export, import within Canada, open new businesses, expand. So if you can talk about the CFTA on that angle, that would be wonderful. How important that we can leverage this.
I would say it's critical, absolutely critical, because the Canadian Free Trade Agreement is, if a small business has trouble selling goods or services across provincial boundaries, the likelihood they're going to try to go international is even more remote. And so by getting rid of some of those barriers that's happening between provinces, I think is going to go a long way in making it a lot easier to do business. Of course, the other factor in all of this is that with the Canadian-European Trade Agreement, there would have been this weird scenario where European companies would have had better access to certain procurement contracts than other Canadian companies would. So we had to do something to really disable or disband some of these barriers. But absolutely, it's critical because this is where small businesses trade. And if we can get them to feel more comfortable trading across the country, we think we can encourage them to start thinking about trading into other countries, which is what we want them to do.
Of course. Thank you. Well, do I have another minute, Mr.
Yeah,
Chair?
you do.
I do want to add, thank you about pointing out some concerns you may have on the multiplication of a small business deduction. It's the first I've heard in terms of the language that's been used here, so I definitely want to take a look at that. I do want to add that it's not in Bill C-63, but it was announced that we'd be lowering the small business tax rate to 9% by the end of 2018, which will provide up to about $7,500 in tax savings to your members. So I think we need to applaud that. Moving on to Ms. Agnew, nurse practitioners. Our healthcare system innovates along the way and provides innovative solutions, and I can use the word innovation if I can on that angle. And flexibility. And I see the contents of the C-63 as providing enhanced flexibility for patients because nurse practitioners will be able to fill, say, a void and gap in certain areas geographically, but also provide flexibility to the healthcare system. Just how important is that for nurse practitioners to basically have this right, or be giving this responsibility for their patients?
So the omnibus bill includes numerous forms that will be changed and now can be accepted. The signature of a nurse practitioner can be accepted. And what that does is it helps to provide expeditious care with someone who's gotten to know the client and has assessed the client. It also decreases extra visits back for a client to see another healthcare professional, so it's very cost effective that way.
That Bill C-63 and providing nurse practitioners with that additional responsibility will potentially save the healthcare system dollars, will improve healthcare outcomes for individuals or patients, if I can use that term correctly, which I think is great.
Absolutely.
And thank you very much for commenting. I do want to move on to Mr. McDonald. How important it is for students to get internships and get that experience, just in general, if you want to comment on that angle, please.
Nothing. You're next.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that our 22 student government members in both college, polytechnic, and undergraduate associations, graduate associations, have all seen that in the changing nature of post-secondary education, it's critical that being able to get access to kind of on-the-job opportunities if a student wants them. And we think that overall that the promotion of more work integrated learning opportunities that are clearly compensated and that show students the value of their work. Like, this is something that's critical. If we want students to be able to find those opportunities further on, showing them the value of what they are contributing, giving them paid opportunities, is something that really brings that forward and gives them that opportunity very clearly early on. And we think firms have clearly demonstrated that when those students have been able to come in and learn the kind of firm culture that we think has been something that they've stressed in importance, they are better able to adapt into those kind of private sector opportunities. And we think it's been critical overall. It's a really good opportunity, something that needs to be expanded further into all disciplines.
Okay, Mr. Kamish.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to start with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. You're speaking really fast at one point, so even I had difficulty keeping up, and I wasn't listening to translation. But you mentioned some members are being told or being informed by maybe their accountants or your association to keep 2 ledgers to comply with some of these rules. Can you just explain a little bit more about that, on why you'll need to have 2 ledgers now, in terms of just to ensure you have an opportunity to comply with some of these rules that are being introduced?
Yes. So in Budget 2016, there were some changes made to on what they call the multiplication of the small business deduction, which was to prevent, I believe it was mostly professionals that they felt were taking advantage of the small business deduction more than once. But in doing so, I think when the rules came out, it ended up having a far broader reach because there was, again, a lack of clarity around what it actually meant. And it ended up having an impact on businesses or family businesses that are maybe doing business with each other, but they may not actually have ownership in each other's business. So in many smaller remote communities in Canada, sometimes families own multiple different businesses and they're each individually owning those businesses, but they have to do business with each other because they don't have any other suppliers. And that's seen now as potentially being caught in this rule. And to avoid it, their accountants are telling them right now that you should probably keep 2 sets of books. Those that are the businesses that you're doing with your own family members, just to sort of keep that separate from the business that you're doing with non-family members. And at the end of the year to sort of clarify, and then basically the ones that you're doing with family members, any earnings you get from that, you're not able to get the small business rate. And any of the earnings, of course, that you do with non-family members, you are able to get the small business rate. So it's adding not just it's adding complexity. There's a lack of clarity and information about if this is the way they could go. They're just going based on what their accountants are telling them. We've tried to get some greater clarity from finance on this, and we haven't necessarily gotten, I think, very clear feedback on if this is the right way to go or if this is what they have to do. So we're still suggesting that we need to do more. We need to do more to understand what the impacts are of these changes, because I think, in my opinion, they've gone more broadly than they were originally intended to go.
And so 2 things there. So you're saying that this has a greater impact in rural communities where there are less opportunities to find competitors, other suppliers, so you will do business within a family or with relatives that you know. There's also a certain amount of trust that you have in them that they're going to pay on time, they're going to be, good clients of yours and good supporters of the business. But also this compliance measure of it. So you said you, talking to finance, the information you got back wasn't as clear, and there's a lack of clarity there to clarify the rules?
Well, we've asked them to provide us with feedback on what advice we can give our members who are in this situation, and we haven't received any feedback on that. Essentially, it's like go talk to their accountants. So they're doing what their accountants are telling them, and their accountants are basing on what they can see and they're trying to be as cautious as possible to make sure that they're abiding properly with the rules.
So then keeping 2 sets of books in order to hopefully comply with whatever the tax man in the day determines is fair taxation, so to speak, that must be more expensive for members.
Absolutely. I would suggest that's even the bigger issue that we're dealing with right now. It's the actual complications and the administrative burden this is adding than the fact that they're not able to get the small business deduction on a proportion of their...
Has your association determined on average what that cost could be to a small business?
We don't really know how broad it is at the moment. Again, I gave you one example of a family farm in rural Alberta. I have another example from, again, a small community where the child owns a construction company, the parent owns a lumber yard. Again, it's a small town, so most of their lumber comes from their parents. But they're 2 different companies, but they're being caught in this as well. And so they've been given the same advice. So it's out there and it's happening. I was left with the impression after the budget 2016 that this was not the intent of these changes. And so that's what we worry about in terms of where we're going to go forward. And that's why we suggest further analysis needs to be done on this.
How much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
You got time for a very short question.
Very short question. So when these changes were introduced in 2016, was your organization consulted before these changes were introduced?
We were told a little bit about what the planned changes were coming, and we told it shouldn't affect the vast majority of our members. So that's why we weren't too concerned when we first saw it in the budget, but then when the actual legislation came out, that's when we started hearing concerns from accounting members and individual members.
Okay.
Thank you both. When did you ask Finance for clarity on this issue? Do you remember?
We sent a letter to the Finance Minister's office back in February. I can send a copy of that letter to you.
If you could send us a copy, because we'll give notice to Finance right now. They'll be here Monday the 20, whatever, Tuesday the 20, whatever it is, and we'll ask them then.
Great.
Mr. Dussault.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you very much, Chair. First of all, I would like to ask questions of Ms. McIntyre on the changes to the Canada Labour Code with respect to domestic or family violence. I think you've set the case out very clearly in favor of paid leave. And I think from what you've said, everybody should agree that to get somebody out of a violent environment in a family, that person should not be penalized in any way. Getting out of that violent situation without any income would just make things all that much more difficult. Are you aware of the definition of who can obtain this type of leave for family violence? Certainly, the person who is the aggressor cannot. Can you tell me if there are other jurisdictions that have similar leave for problems like that? And where were there problems that arose? What solutions did they find to the problems that arose to help the victim of family violence?
For the question, I'm not aware of other jurisdictions where the leave is paid. My understanding is in a couple of jurisdictions in Canada, leave has been introduced, but it's been unpaid leave. And I understand it's a difficult situation deciding who's eligible, because I understand the distaste in the thought that someone who is an abuser would access this and benefit from it. But because of the well-intentioned practice of dual charging, it does mean that victims can end up being charged. And so I think it's a question of balancing the benefit to those victims who may otherwise be excluded with the distasteful aspect of providing paid leave to people who are abusers. And I mean that's the difficult decision that you'll have to make. But I think I would tend to err on the side of making the leave available, even in the cases where people have been charged, because I think it likely will capture women who really need that time off and who need that money. And the example, from the Nurse Practitioners Association is compelling on that front. We do see women return to abusive situations because they financially can't leave, or they're concerned that, as I said, that their children might be apprehended because they're not providing sufficiently for their basic necessities, and the consequences can in fact be fatal. So I would weigh that against the unpleasantness of the thought that some of the beneficiaries of paid leave would be actually abusers.
So yes, we will have to try to find a way to address the situation to ensure that it is dealt with in the proper way. Now, for the nurse practitioners, are you aware of the difficulty that arose with the income tax credit for diabetics? That is to say, the disability tax credit that is being denied to some people who have diabetes 1.
Aware of that.
Okay.
I would have had another question to ask about that. However, for the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, in recent meetings, we've heard a great deal about the different ways of accounting, current billing accounting. In the bill, they talk about eliminating the possibility for lawyers and accountants and other professionals to use a bill-based accounting. Have any of your members spoken to you about this change in the bill, and what would that mean in terms of difficulties?
No one has come to us. We do have some professionals as members, but it's certainly not a large part of our membership. I suspect that they would be working with their professional associations if they have concerns, be raising them. So I cannot personally speak to that. I'm sorry.
problème. Puis,
Malheureusement, on n'a plus le temps.
Unfortunately, you're out of time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you all for coming today, and I have to say it's rare. It's rare at Finance Committee sometimes when we hear things that actually surprise us. And one of the things that did surprise me was, Ms. McInturf, was your once again it's your great testimony before this committee. We had just heard from you a couple of months ago, and that was a very powerful testimony. But again, today you brought up one of the unintended consequences of this, which has one thing which I hadn't considered in regards to the notion of double charging. Can you help us out? What type of wording would you suggest that we could use in this regard, understanding what the intention was?
Yeah.
What kind of wording would allow us to avoid that unfortunate situation in that particular jurisdiction?
Well, I mean, I think given the consequences of not providing adequate financial support to allow women or men to leave a violent setting, given that the consequences can be fatal, I think it is worth extending leave and frankly paid leave even to people who are experiencing domestic violence and who may have been charged as a result of dual charging. I think
you understand the problem that we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, and so that I would remove the, as it is presented in the current bill, it would exclude that class of people, and I would not exclude them, even though I understand on the face of it, it sounds like you're supporting abusers, which obviously you don't want to do. But to leave out the people who would potentially need that and who would be excluded unintentionally would cause dire consequences for them. And also, just to follow up a little, I understand there's a cost involved, of course, for employers, but I want to reiterate that, not addressing this issue and not empowering people who are being abused to leave the setting and have the means to do it, the time off and the finances to do it, means that the abuse goes on, and this comes at a huge cost for employers. I mean, again, $68.5 million in lost productivity to employers as a result of spousal violence. So I think, although there is a cost there, we can also see that allowing women the means to leave those situations sooner is better for them, it's better for their families, and it will actually save on lost productivity in the long run for employers.
So forgive me for going back to this question, if you'll indulge me, Mr. Chair. I would just want to get back to the point. I have to admit, I'm a little uncomfortable with leaving the door wide open.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping you can help me out here as to what way that, just given the limitation, I know this is an unfair question to ask you, but I'm just trying to figure out some way that we could, what type of wording could we use that would, yes, exclude those who are being charged, except for those in this dual.
I mean, this might be a case where it would be useful to go to the provinces and talk to them about how they're dealing with this in the provinces where they do have dual charging, as they do in Ontario. Because, I mean, it may be that you have a charge and then it's dropped again because it's recognized as the processes through the judicial system that the person being charged was actually the victim, the aggressor, and there are ways for the police to note that in their initial charging. But in some cases, I think the police, when they're on those calls, feel that their hands are tied and they have to, you're there, you have two people who are very angry and upset, and they're making accusations both about each other, and it is possible, over time to figure out, well, one person was clearly the aggressor and the other person was defending him or herself. But in the initial case, they feel they have to charge both. So there may be ways of I would say, talking to the jurisdictions where they practice this to figure out a way of wording the exclusion such that it doesn't unintentionally capture the victims of violence. But I think that's beyond my expertise. I mean, you really need to talk to the police forces about how they handle these and if there's some way to create a definition that would capture those people who are victims but who are still charged initially. But yeah, I'm sorry, it's a sticky problem and I don't have a perfect solution for it.
I see Teresa nodding her head. If you want in, Teresa, just raise your hand and we'll let you in.
I guess my thought is with the wording for it to remain victims of domestic violence, because that doesn't identify perpetrator versus, so that
initially that seems to me to be broad enough to include.
Thank you. For Mr. Mulvihill, recognizing the great work that Mars does and the opportunity that it has, I was wondering also, and thank you very much for your testimony in regards to the measures in Bill C-63. You had also referred to that there are some aspects which can still go a little further. I was wondering if you could just give me just a quick summary, because I think I have a short period of time.
So I guess what you're referring to is some of the gaps that we see in the capital ecosystem. So the Canadian venture capital ecosystem has been growing, but so has our grouping of strong, growing, innovative companies. And if there's one or two particular areas where there is a gap, it would be in the ventures in the health sector and in the clean tech sector. So we've had a good growth in the ICT space, but health and clean tech are an area where we still need to develop more management expertise in those sectors and also build the pool of capital for ventures.
Thank you both. Mr. Albus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses for your testimony today. I'm going to start with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Ms. Pullman, thank you for being here and for raising the issue about indirect interests. Obviously, governments need to be upfront and clear with the business community. Businesses don't just require opportunity to grow, they also need certainty. So when suddenly the government introduces rules that are vague or do not necessarily allow them to understand how they need to comply, it can trigger all sorts of unintended consequences. People stop doing things just because they're not sure. It's a gray zone. And oftentimes accountants are some of the most conservative in the term of business sense, Mr. Chair. So first of all, has the government been able to convey what problem it is trying to fix by introducing these indirect ownership restrictions?
And my understanding, based on Budget 2016, was to provide rules that will prevent what we understood to be organizations, mostly professionals, who were accessing the small business deduction more than once. And they gave, there was the examples of the law firm where each partner has their own incorporation, plus the law firm itself is incorporated, and they each would get access to the small business deduction. That was my understanding. However, what we're seeing, I think, after the fact is that it goes well beyond that and is having an impact on what I think are, what I would consider middle-class small businesses who are simply trying to make the best of it, and it's bringing complications into the system that they had not foreseen. And it's not only not allowing them to access the small business deduction on certain parts of their corporate earnings, but it's also adding a lot more administrative burden, which again is an extra cost to those businesses. And by not getting good clarity on whether what they're doing is the right approach or the wrong approach, you're right, they're taking that conservative approach that their accountants are telling them to do, because it's not clear right now until we start seeing people challenge the government on it.
One of the biggest challenges I've heard since July 18th was the tax planning for private corporations document. Beyond the rhetoric, many people didn't like being described as utilizing loopholes. One of the things is we heard that there was challenges around family ownership and wanting to have intergenerational transfer, whether it be a farm or a business. So why is government so concerned about when businesses are doing business with one another? Because again, they're going to get their share of tax regardless. And to me, it sounds like they are, with this indirect cost or this indirect method, they are basically creating where they almost want to charge on the shareholder and not by company. Is that correct?
Oh, now you're getting beyond my, this is where it becomes very complicated.
Yeah, because yesterday we were trying to get the Minister of Finance to actually build some certainty in the business community, because they said they want to tax passive investments, but they're not being clear of whether or not the minimum, or I should say the thresholds, where you go to a much higher rate on passive income is by shareholder, which it doesn't matter how many businesses you own, if you get that exemption for $50,000 versus for someone who is by company.
Well, look, the current tax changes that are on the table, I mean, there were amendments made, some of which are very good, but there were other amendments that there's certain elements of those tax changes that are still moving forward, and there's lots of details we still don't know. And I think that's creating a lot of uncertainty, and we need those details quickly, and we need to understand what those impacts are going to be. And I would use the changes to the multiplication of the small business deduction as an example of what could happen if we're not looking at this closely and understanding what those unintended consequences are. And it isn't just impacting a few, it's impacting many. And that's our fear with these proposed changes that are still on the table.
And some might say that tax cuts, are a wonderful thing, and I usually think that they can be good. But again, like private campgrounds that apparently are not small enough, or where they only have 5 employees, are being ruled out for that deduction. Mm-hmm. Doctors, such as radiologists that are working in a shared practice, they've been disallowed. And until this bill, the cooperatives, the farmers and fishers, would have been disallowed. So how does the government fix the indirect costs? Should it just, would you say, repeal that legislation and be agnostic when it comes to the interactions between family?
Absolutely. I think what's needed is some clarity, such as the farmers and fishers got around cooperatives, as to what does it mean when family members do business with each other, but they don't have any other, they don't own shares in each other's company. They're still separate companies, and I think that's the issue that needs to be properly
We'll have to end it there, and I believe the minister said yesterday in response to those questions on passive income that they're still working that through, and we'll make an announcement in the not too distant future. Mr. McLeod.
Chair, and thank you to the presenters today. I got a few questions here. The first one to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I listened with real interest when you talked about the issue of housing and how it affected employers, and you pointed to domestic abuse as being something that's resulted from housing. I just sat on a committee that reviewed the issue of suicide in Aboriginal communities across the country, and it's horrific what we found in terms of numbers and the despair that we're exposed to. And housing was one. There's many issues that are causing the despair within our youth, but housing was pointed to as one that was a fixable solution. And it was mentioned many times that if we could fix the issue of housing that has worsened over the years, if we could fix that we'd solve 50% of our social issues that are challenging us. Because housing is a factor in domestic abuse, but in our Aboriginal communities, it's also a real factor in sexual abuse. And it's also a factor when it comes to suicide. It also limits our people to be able to find hang on to gainful employment. And students have a hard time to study, and it causes lower grades. So I'm assuming you have some research that you could share with us, Mr. Chair. Maybe she could provide that to us. So my next question is to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. I represent Northwest Territories. Almost all our communities are Aboriginal, and we really have a challenge because we have a change on how we live. Many things are causing that, and our culture is being diluted. And a lot of our elders say that our youth have to live in two cultures now. They have to have a foot in both worlds. Some of the people in the elders in the Tlicho Nation say that you have to be strong like two people, because you have to be able to know how to hunt. You have to be able to know how to fish and berry pick and trap and all these traditional pursuits that we've done historically. But at the same time, you have to have a full-time job to look after your family. So we were quite happy to see the flexibility in the labor code changes. We know that there was a lot of work done with Indigenous governments, Indigenous people in terms of consultation. And so I'm just wondering why you're making the recommendations not to go ahead. have you talked to Indigenous people? Have you gone out and consulted with Indigenous governments and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit? Because it seems like there was a lot of work done on this, and I'm not sure where you're getting your direction from. I'm assuming. I'll let you answer.
Sure. So it's from our membership. So our membership is 109,000 small and medium-sized business owners across Canada, including in the Northwest Territories. We have over 250 members in the Northwest Territories. So it came from them. It's the direction we get from them. And the reason we sort of prefer not making prescriptive changes to flexible work arrangements because we worry that when you get too prescriptive around some of these labor code changes, it almost then takes away from a lot of the flexibility that already exists. And small companies, they know their employees very well, and they tend to know what's going on with them because the owner works beside the employee. And we know that they already provide a lot of flexibility. We have done public opinion polling recently of employees and found that those that work at the smallest companies, the best thing they like about working at a small company is the flexibility they provide. And so what we worry about is when we start implementing requirements around these, that it can restrict sometimes the flexibility that already exists.
To go to the question I just asked you.
What's that?
Have you talked to any Indigenous people on this?
Well, we talk to our membership.
That's
where we get our direction from. We get our direction from our
I'm asking you if you've talked to any Indigenous governments about this.
No, I've not talked to Indigenous governments.
Thank you. My next question is to the nurse practitioners, and I really appreciate the work that you've done to allow the nurse practitioners to enhance their role. We depend lots on nurse practitioners in the north, in all 3 territories in the north. A lot of times it's difficult to see a doctor, and if you do, you're probably not going to see him again or her again. And I wanted you to maybe discuss with us your organization's work in the remote areas of the province that you're in, and maybe the rest of Canada, and how that's being received by members and the people that they assist.
So there's now close to 5,000 nurse practitioners across Canada, and many of those nurse practitioners work in rural and remote and northern areas across every jurisdiction. I myself had the pleasure of working for a year up in Moose Factory Zone and providing primary care services to the communities up of the James Bay coast. And I would say nurse practitioners are somewhat disproportionately represented in underserviced northern and remote areas. Mm-hmm.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you all. Mr. Kamish, I guess, for about 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to go back to Confederation of Independent Business, talk about temporary, the flexible work arrangements specifically. A lot of these rules proposed in C63 is about federally regulated employees. So my question to you is first, because you had said that you're kind of worried about it. So first question is, what kind of impact will it have on your members? Because you do represent small, medium-sized businesses. So which of your members would specifically be most impacted by this? And 2, what would be your suggestions for amendments or modifications to the proposal put forward in C63?
Sure. So the impacts, of course, will be, it's federally regulated, and we recognize that not a lot of small firms are federally regulated. There are some, but not many. But what happens is that often federal regulations then gets copied by provincial regulations, and therefore it ends up spreading across the country. And so we worry, again, that it tends to limit the ability of smaller firms to work out flexible arrangements that work for them and their employees. And we already know they're offering a lot of that informally already, and we worry that it will limit what's already out there. So the other piece of this is that it brings in more administrative burden and more rules that the employer has to make sure they're following when they're going through this process. In order to, the adjustments we would make, if we're going to move forward with some sort of legislation, at the very least, we'd like to see The amount of time that the employer has to respond to a request is only 30 days in the legislation right now. We'd like to see that go to 3 months. That is what actually is the case in the UK, which we know is part of what this has been modeled after. Also, there's not a lot of detail in this legislation around enforcement, what that's going to look like, how that's going to impact employers and employees for that matter, nor is there much information. Is there going to be an appeal process? That's also not clear at this point in time. So those are things that are still question marks and worries for us.
So just to go back on the types of members of yours to be affected, the trucking companies, obviously.
Federally, yes.
Federally. And then would it be anyone else outside of that? Who would be like a
small airlines?
Small airlines?
Yes, there's small airlines that are all over the place. There's small, and mostly they'll be the smaller trucking companies that might be federally regulated. And there might be some small broadcasters and that kind of thing.
Small broadcasters as well. One of the things that you mentioned as well was that smaller employees really know, smaller employers really know like the people who work for them because you work so closely. Typically, you work for them for a long time. Parliament's an employer. I mean, we all work here. I have my daughter with me today. I call her the junior member for Calgary Shepherd. So she's just sitting in the back with me. In my experience, I've worked in human resources before. In my experience, smaller members already make a lot of accommodations for their for the people who work for them. It costs thousands of dollars to replace an employee who leaves for whatever reason. So is it your experience that most small and medium-sized employers will do what they can to accommodate their current employees?
Absolutely, because they know by doing that they'll attract more, that they'll retain the ones that are there. It's very expensive to hire and train new people, so you're going to do everything you can to keep the good people that you have at your organization. And part of that is being flexible when you need to be flexible. I mean, the number of stories you hear from small business owners and from their employees about them going through a tough time and how their employer helped them through that there's many of them. Because often it's not just that they know their employees, often it's their own family members working for them. I mean, there's a combination of that and they become a family. So I would suggest to you that smaller companies are already doing quite a bit on the flexibility front. It's just not formalized.
Okay, we will have to end it there. Nobody else got any comments from the witnesses? Mr. Graywell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to witnesses for coming. Really appreciate it. My question is, again, not that we're picking on the Canadian Independent Federation of Businesses. I just wanted to get your take on, when we traveled across the country for pre-budget consultations, government red tape, and I just spoke at the Loblaws Carrier Conference, which is a lot of small business, a lot of trucking companies that carry for Loblaws across this country, and they were really excited when I talked about the Canada Free Trade Agreement. What else can we do that can really, reduce the red tape to make sure that the Canadian economy continues to grow at a record pace?
So I think when it comes to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, a key piece of that is the regulatory cooperation and table that they've created, right? And we have some concerns right now that it hasn't really been moving forward the way it should. And I think we really would encourage the government to take some leadership and get the provinces moving to make this table work. Because the point of the table is for the provinces to work together with the federal government to align a lot of the rules and regulations that exist. Trucking is a perfect example.
Yeah, it's actually comical that there's different standards across the country through the 10 provinces and 3 territories.
Correct. For something as simple as changing the color of the warning flag on the back of your truck, you have to stop at a border and change it. So that's the kind of thing we'd like this cooperate, and this is the key part to the whole Canadian Free Trade Agreement that needs to get up and running, it needs to be active, and it needs to show it's actually going to have results, and we need the federal government to be part of that.
Thank you. The Canadian Alliance of Students Associations. So I was an intern. So I know how important it is to give students an opportunity to gain work experience, but at the same time, we've got to make sure that they don't get taken advantage of by their employers. You had a statistic that children that graduate with co-op experience have a better chance at a full-time job. I came out of Laurier's co-op program, so yes, I had a better chance at a full-time job, and I was employed a year before I graduated. What can the federal government do more to ensure that those opportunities exist, even though we're doing a lot to ensure we're empowering young Canadians? But I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think this government has shown a kind of commitment with some of its investments in working at graded learning that recently were announced just at the end of August, which were creating kind of opportunities for STEM and business students, were an excellent jumping off point. We do think that these kind of programs where you create sector relationships between both academic institutions, both at the college and university level, and sector partners to be able to create work integrated learning opportunities kind of worked into programs, it's a great start. The second thing that we think could be really valuable, and it's something we've included in our pre-budget submissions that I know that our chair spoke to you as well earlier this year, was changing the Canada Summer Jobs program as it currently stands to provide what are part-time opportunities for the remainder of the year. This is a program that provides people experience in field, provides small business and not-for-profits financial support to be able to hire students, and we think these are the kind of models to move forward with and to find those kind of partnerships that support both the industry, the academics, and the students in general that really meet everybody's needs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That will be the last question then on Bill C-63. Just for committee members, the deadline to submit amendments on this bill is 12 p.m. on 5 p.m. 12 p.m.
12 noon.
We had 12 noon on November 16th. And we'll start clause by clause on November 21st at 8:45 in the morning and go through till, if we have to 9 o'clock that night. So that's on Monday or Tuesday the 21st. Okay, with that, thank you, witnesses. Really appreciate your coming forward and answering questions. Thank you very much. So we'll now turn to we'll turn to your motion, Mr. Dussault. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to thank the witnesses who are leaving now. Thank you for your presence here today. And I thank you for having set aside time so that we can discuss the motion that I gave notice about last Tuesday, and which is very timely given the news. I will read it again at the outset so that we all know what we're deciding today. So the motion in English
that could implicate some Canadians in aggressive tax avoidance or tax evasion. The committee invited Stephen Bronfman, a revenue chair for the Liberal Party of Canada, and Leo Colbert, former senator and former chief fundraiser for the Liberal Party of Canada, to appear before the Standing Committee on Finance before November 38th to answer questions relating to their offshore assets in jurisdictions that are considered to be tax havens. Alors, la raison de...
So the reason behind this motion is quite simple. I gave an explanation for it when I tabled the notice of motion, but seeking to enlighten the committee about the financial stratagems used by these two individuals, not to put them on trial here, or decide whether it was legal or illegal. And the purpose of this is not a trial, but to have the facts before us and find out more about these financial mechanisms, because all Canadians have seen this in the news and were shocked to learn that certain strategies, such as those used by these two individuals, that is, trusts in foreign countries, allow them to hide, for all intents and purposes, some of their assets and make profit from these investments that fructify and are placed in all kinds of places worldwide. These assets that generate revenue in foreign countries with very low or non-existent tax rates. We'd like to hear these people so that they can explain for themselves. They say that these actions are legal, and we'd like them to explain how they set aside these assets free of tax. And then we as a committee
can address the deficiencies in the Income Tax Act and allow the committee to address the fundamental problem here, which means that these individuals can use these mechanisms and avoid paying their fair share of taxes in our society. There are individuals who benefit from our healthcare system. I don't know Mr. Bronfman or Mr. Colber personally, but I wouldn't be surprised to hear they've been to the hospital at some point in Canada. They benefit from our healthcare system, from our roads. These people are in Canada. They use our highways, our roads. They benefit from our infrastructure. But at the same time, they don't pay taxes, or just about none. And they manage this while taking advantage of our society and the services offered by our governments. Governments that at the same time have trouble delivering high-quality services to our citizens because of a tax system that is being eroded. I'm not the one saying so. There's a lot of work being done internationally on this question of the erosion of the tax base and the transfer of profits to foreign countries. So this would be an opportunity for the committee to learn more, and that's why there's not any closure date to this study. I would like to see them before November 30th, but there's no final deadline indicated in the motion. But to my mind, the objective would be to try to find solutions to this situation. I believe that Canadians would be pleased to see the Finance Committee of the House of Commons address this newsworthy situation and find some kinds of solutions that are within our scope to put an end to these scandals that come back time and time again in the news, both in Canada and worldwide. So I hope I'll get the support of my colleagues to respond to a demand and concern by Canadians, a feeling shared by many Canadians and my colleagues too. So I hope that all my friends here around the table will support this so that we can hear these people and find solutions.
First on my list is Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to move that the debate be now adjourned.
The motion is in order.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
There's no notice required.
That's okay. I just have a separate point of order.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We just received a motion from Mr. Dussault, which members of the Conservative delegation were planning to support. We think that it is...
Point of order.
No, it isn't. You're right. But I am coming to my point.
There's I'm sorry, Pierre, there's no debate allowed on this kind of a motion.
And I'm not debating the member's motion. I have no comment on her motion whatsoever.
But I'm going to disallow the debate. I don't see it as a point of order. I'm going to call the vote.
Please,
recorded vote.
I'm surprised by this decision.
Okay, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to note for the record that no member of the governing caucus were prepared to defend their position on this issue or their party's position on the issue.
There's no debate. Pull the mic. So the motion is on the floor, Madam Chair. Or Madam Clerk, rather. Mr. Clerk. We'll get it right.
Mr. Fergus.
I support the motion.
Mr. Graywell.
Yes.
Mr. McLeod.
Yes.
Ms. O'Connell.
Yes.
Mr. Sorbera.
Yes.
Mr. Albus.
No.
Mr. Kimish.
No.
Mr. Poilievre.
No.
Mr. Dussault.
No.
The motion is carried. I would point out that this means temporarily suspend debate under the way on the motion or study. That's what it says in the House of Commons procedures. Turning then to the next order of business, which is...
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Point of order.
I understand the members have temporarily delayed debate on this motion, and we'll be revisiting the subject forthwith. When do you foresee us having an opportunity to do that?
That well, we certainly won't until we come back, but that depends when somebody wants to lift it off the table. That's my understanding.
I wonder if I could put forward a motion for unanimous agreement that we would have a special hearing into this matter, and that the members of each party will confer to ensure that we are able to do this within the next 2 weeks.
I do not see that. If somebody wants to move a motion outside of the day that we're dealing with the Bill C-63, they have the right to do so. They can lift it off the table, and we'll be back here on the week of the 20th. Mr. Dussault had his hand up next, and then Mr. Ferguson, and then Mr. Albus.
Oui, j'aimerais.
Yes, I'd like to propose the following motion. That this committee resume a study of my motion at the earliest opportunity available to the committee.
Can you tell us what your motion is again, Pierre?
Que le comité poursuive l'étude.
Committee resume examination of the motion standing under Pierre-Luc Dussault at the earliest opportunity.
At the earliest opportunity would be the week of the 20th. It is in order. Okay, it's on the table.
I'd like to speak to that.
I had Mr. Fergus on my list next, then Mr. Albus.
But I'm speaking on his motion that he just made. Is that
Okay.
not right on the table? I'm going to move that the debate be now adjourned.
I have
No,
the floor.
Mr. Fergus had the floor, sorry. Mr. Fergus.
To move that the committee, that the debate be now adjourned.
A recorded vote. I just want to convene with the clerk here for a minute. Vote, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Fergus. Mr. Graywall.
Yes.
Mr. McLeod.
Yes.
Ms. O'Connell.
Yes.
Mr. Sobera. Mr. Albus.
No.
Mr. Kimmich.
No.
Mr. Poliev.
No.
Mr. Dussault.
No to closure.
The motion is lost. I'm going to the next item on the agenda,
Mr. Chair.
which is the I'm going to the next item.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Let's hear it.
I have a different motion that the committee commence a study regarding the that would in reference to aggressive tax avoidance or tax evasion.
That's not a point of order. It isn't a point of order.
Well, Mr. Chair, we are able to make motions. That the clerk ruled earlier that a motion similarly put was in order.
You said you were making a point of order.
Well, I will put a motion then.
Then put your motion.
Okay, my motion is.
Before you do, if I could, just as a point of interest, Mr. Dussault's motion, the original one, can be pulled up by him at the next meeting if he so decides. It's a temporary suspension. So why we would go through a whole bunch of procedural wrangling here, I don't know, because he will have the opportunity to pull his motion off the table if he just so decides, or anybody else in the committee. I think anybody can pull that motion, right? Or is it just Mr. Dussault? Anybody. So why would we go through a whole series of procedural wrangling when that's the possibility?
I can answer your question, Mr. Chair. We seek only when motions are put that there be an opportunity to have a debate on them. Now, the members across the way have tried to stifle that debate in use of their majority and shut down any scrutiny of this matter. Now, obviously, this is a matter of great importance to Canadians. Tax evasion, tax avoidance has major impact on the revenues of the Government of Canada and on the fairness of our overall tax system. It shifts the burden to middle-class people by allowing those who are well-connected and wealthy enough to stash their cash where it's out of reach from the government, and their tax obligations are go unsatisfied. Now, I will promise to put that. The reason you asked the question of me, and I'm answering that question. Now, I move that. Given the ongoing media revelations that could implicate some Canadians in aggressive tax avoidance or tax evasion, the committee invites Stephen Bronfman, Revenue Chair of the Liberal Party of Canada, and Leo Colbert, former Senator and former Chief Fundraiser for the Liberal Party of Canada, to appear before the Standing Committee on Finance before, and here's where the difference comes in, before November 25th, to answer questions relating to their offshore assets in jurisdictions that are considered to be tax havens. Mr. Chair, I understand if members want to shut down this debate, as they did the last one. I would just seek the opportunity to state very briefly why I think it's important. Canadians, this is a matter in the public interest related to the Finance Committee. The government claims it's in favor of tax fairness, but yet they're favoring well-connected and wealthy insiders, allowing them to avoid paying their fair share of taxes while raising the tax burden on everyday Canadians. The fact that the government is fighting so furiously to keep this debate from happening, to shut it down before anyone can speak, demonstrates that they don't want any transparency in this particular area. They have not even given a single piece of rationale as to why they wouldn't want to have the debate if their party and their government has nothing to hide on the subject. They said that tax fairness was their #1 priority. Mr. Dussault put forward a motion that would allow them to prove it. So I ask that they vote. I know that the problem they had was with November 30th as opposed to November 25th, which I put forward as an debate. I think because it's such a priority to the government, maybe we should move the date forward. Rather than moving it to the 30th. Maybe members across the way were so anxious to get started with this examination that they couldn't wait till November 30th. So I'm giving them an alternative. Thank you.
I have next. Who's next on the list? Mr. Fergus, Mr. Dussault, and Mr. Elvis.
Mr. Chair, I move that the committee do now adjourn.
Okay. Then there is no debate on this motion either. Okay, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Fergus.
Good job, okay, we're calling the recorded vote here, folks.
Mr. Fergus.
I agree.
Mr. Greywall.
Yes.
Mr. McLeod.
Yes.
I want to go home.
Ms. O'Connell.
Yes.
Mr. Sorbera.
Meeting. Yes.
Mr. Albus.
No.
Mr. Kimish.
No.
Mr. Poliev.
Nope.
Monsieur Dussault.
No.
Then the motion is agreed to, and the meeting is adjourned.